The courtroom was cold, sterile, and unforgiving. The hard wooden benches, the glaring fluorescent lights overhead, and the smell of stale air seemed to press down on Jake in a way that made his chest tighten. His heart raced as he sat there, slouched and nervous, a stark contrast to the confident figure standing at the front of the room. The judge, a heavy-set man with a permanent scowl, peered over his glasses at the papers in front of him, barely acknowledging Jake's presence. "Jake Thompson," the judge's voice boomed, his words dripping with disdain. "You're accused of vandalizing the school computer lab. How do you plead?" Jake swallowed hard. His throat felt dry, his hands trembling at his sides. He wasn't sure how he ended up here. One moment, he had been sitting in class, minding his business, and the next, his entire life had been turned upside down. It didn't make sense. He had no motive to destroy the computer lab. In fact, he had always been the quiet, bookish type, hardly the sort to act out in such a way. But here he was, accused of something he didn't do. I didn't do it, Your Honor," Jake stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. The judge didn't even look up. Instead, he flicked his pen across the papers in front of him, clearly uninterested. "Really?" "Because the evidence says otherwise," the judge muttered, clearly unimpressed. His gaze swept over Jake as if he were little more than an annoying inconvenience. "Aren't you a little too young to be here, kid? What's your excuse? No one believes you. Not after the damage you caused." Jake's stomach churned. He could feel the eyes of the courtroom on him, some sympathetic, others judgmental, and some downright hostile. The whispers started to rise like a tidal wave. It felt like the walls were closing in on him. Everyone already had their opinion. They already believed he was guilty. "This is it," Jake thought. "I'm done." The judge's gavel slammed down, breaking the silence. "Enough of the excuses, Thompson. You'll learn to take responsibility for your actions." The judge's voice was sharp, his tone dismissive. Jake looked down at his shoes, suddenly wishing he could vanish into thin air. He hadn't even been given a chance to explain himself. They all assumed he was guilty based on the evidence that didn't make sense to him. The computer lab was damaged, sure, but he had been nowhere near it when it happened. He knew he was innocent, but the system? The system didn't care about his innocence. It only cared about the facts, and the facts pointed straight to him. That's when it happened. Just as Jake's mind started to race with panic, a sudden voice interrupted the judge's scorn. "Your Honor," a smooth voice rang out, cutting through the tension like a knife. "I'm Mr. Davis, and I'll be representing Mr. Thompson today." Jake's head snapped up. A man had entered the courtroom, a tall figure in a sharply tailored suit. His dark hair was perfectly combed, and his face carried an air of quiet confidence. He wasn't someone you'd expect to see in a place like this, a courtroom full of grim-faced lawyers, disinterested officials, and downtrodden defendants. This man, however, seemed completely at ease, his every movement calculated and composed. He didn't appear rattled by the judge's harsh words, nor did he flinch when the room's attention turned to him. The judge glanced up, his eyebrows raising in surprise. "And who exactly are you supposed to be?" "Mr. Davis," the man repeated, his voice calm but firm. "I'm Jake Thompson's attorney. I'm here to ensure that my client gets a fair trial." There was a pause. The judge looked at Mr. Davis, clearly skeptical, before shifting his gaze back to Jake. "Very well," the judge said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Let's see what you've got, Mr. Davis. Though I don't expect much from someone so young." The judge's mocking tone was evident, but Mr. Davis didn't flinch. Instead, he nodded respectfully. "I'll do my best, Your Honor." Jake, still stunned by the sudden appearance of this stranger, barely registered what was happening. His heart was still hammering in his chest, and the weight of the judge's words hung heavy in the air. But something about Mr. Davis's calm demeanor eased his nerves, even if just a little. He had no idea who this man was or why he was willing to help him, but Jake was thankful, grateful even, that someone had shown up for him. "Mr. Davis," the judge said, still condescending. "I assume you're aware of the nature of the charges against this young man. The evidence is pretty clear-cut." "I am aware, Your Honor," Mr. Davis replied, his voice unwavering. "But I would like the opportunity to present my findings and demonstrate that my client may not be the person responsible for this incident." The judge snorted. "Findings? We'll see about that." The courtroom was tense, the air thick with anticipation as Mr. Davis walked up to the front of the room, standing beside Jake. The judge motioned for him to proceed, his expression clearly one of disbelief. And then, Mr. Davis did something unexpected. Instead of immediately launching into his defense, he turned toward Jake, offering him a small, encouraging smile. "Don't worry, Jake," he said quietly. "I've got this. Just stay calm, and let me do the talking." Jake blinked, momentarily caught off guard. No one had ever spoken to him like that before. No one had ever offered him comfort in a situation like this. Sure, he had Emily, the one person who always had his back, but she wasn't here. She couldn't be. He was alone in this courtroom, surrounded by strangers who believed the worst about him. Yet, somehow, this man, this Mr. Davis, was different. His words, though simple, offered a small glimmer of hope. Jake tried to steady his breathing, his mind racing with questions. Who was this man? What did he see in Jake that others didn't? Why had he chosen to help him? Mr. Davis began to speak, addressing the court with a calm but undeniable confidence. "Your Honor, I'm not here to waste your time. I'm here to prove my client's innocence." The words rang out with certainty, and for the first time that day, Jake felt like maybe, just maybe, things would be okay. He wasn't sure how it would all play out, but he wasn't alone anymore. The real battle was just beginning. This story might just spark a new beginning, Mr. Davis had said. And Jake couldn't help but wonder, as the tension in the room continued to rise. As the trial continued, Jake realized he wasn't just fighting for his freedom. He was fighting for something far greater, a chance to finally be seen for who he really was. And with Mr. Davis by his side, he felt like he just might stand a chance. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The courtroom buzzed as Mr. Davis smoothly took control of the proceedings, questioning witnesses and presenting evidence in a way that left everyone in the room stunned. But as Jake sat there, trying to absorb everything, his mind kept drifting back to his life outside the courtroom, his world, the world that had brought him here. Jake Thompson wasn't the kind of kid who attracted attention. At least, not the kind of attention that he wanted. He was quiet, too quiet, some people would say. With messy brown hair, a bit too long for the school's dress code, and a habit of keeping his head down, he often blended into the background. For years, he'd found solace in the anonymity of being just another student at Liberty High School, the kind of kid nobody really noticed. But inside, things were different. Inside, his mind was sharp, more than most people realized. And that's what got him into trouble. His mother, Linda Thompson, worked double shifts at a local diner to make ends meet. It wasn't a glamorous life, but it was all she knew. She had been raising Jake on her own ever since his father, a man whose face Jake could barely remember, walked out on them when he was just a toddler. It had been just the two of them for as long as Jake could remember. And while his mom was kind and hardworking, the emotional support wasn't always there. She was often too tired to help him with homework or listen to his troubles. And Jake, though he loved his mother dearly, had never known how to ask for help. So, he buried himself in books, and in the logic puzzles he found fascinating. Those puzzles were his escape, the one place where he could see the world in a way that made sense. But none of that mattered now. All that mattered was the cold metal chair he was sitting in and the sinking feeling in his stomach as the trial continued. The world outside of the courtroom felt like it was slipping away. Jake had always been an outsider, but now, it felt like he was even more alone. The accusations swirling around him were heavier than anything he had ever dealt with before. It wasn't just about getting through another school year or passing a test. It was about his entire future, the future he'd never really planned for, but which he had hoped would be different. He had one friend, Emily, and she was more than just a friend. She was the only person who really understood him, the one who had stood by his side through thick and thin. Emily was smart, outgoing, and always seemed to know how to make Jake feel better when things got tough. The two of them had been inseparable since middle school, when Jake had been struggling with bullies and feelings of invisibility. Emily was the one who had encouraged him to enter the debate team, even though he was terrified. She had convinced him that his quiet nature and sharp logic would make him a natural debater. It had taken some convincing, but eventually, Jake had joined, and to his surprise, he was good at it. It wasn't the same as the logic puzzles he loved, but it was close. And in those moments, standing in front of a room full of people, debating with an intensity he didn't know he had, he felt alive. But that was before the vandalism incident. Before the accusations. Before everything started to fall apart. Emily had been there for him every step of the way. She was the first person Jake had called when he was arrested. She'd cried on the phone, telling him she knew he didn't do it, that she'd be by his side no matter what. But even Emily couldn't help him now. Not here. Not in this cold, indifferent courtroom, where it seemed like the whole world had already made up its mind. And then, there was the strange man, Mr. Davis. Jake had no idea what to make of him. Why had he stepped in to defend him? Mr. Davis wasn't some high-powered attorney from a top law firm. He didn't look like someone who was trying to make a name for himself or boost his career. Instead, there was something almost humble about him. Something that didn't fit with the image of a typical lawyer. Jake had heard bits and pieces about Mr. Davis. He was a lawyer who had made a name for himself in the legal world as a brilliant, albeit unconventional, attorney. Some said he had the mind of a genius, but he'd given it all up to take on pro bono cases like Jake's. People said he had once worked for the biggest firms in the country, but after a personal tragedy, he had walked away from it all. And now, he was standing in front of Jake, his demeanor calm, his every word measured. Jake couldn't figure out why this man was so determined to help him. He wasn't rich. He wasn't connected to anyone important. He was just a high school kid with a messed up life and a pile of accusations against him. But there was something in Mr. Davis's eyes, a flicker of something that told Jake that maybe, just maybe, this man saw something in him that no one else did. Maybe Mr. Davis saw potential. Or maybe he saw someone who, despite being written off by everyone else, still had a chance at redemption. Jake didn't know what was happening, but he had to admit, he felt a tiny spark of hope, something he hadn't felt in a long time. As the trial continued, Jake's mind drifted back to his past. The night spent alone, doing his best to make sense of the world, the small victories he'd had, the failures he'd buried deep. His life had never been easy, but he had always managed to get by, always managed to keep moving forward. Until now. The world was changing around him, and Jake didn't know if he was ready for it. He didn't know if he was ready for the storm that was coming. But one thing was for sure, he wasn't going to face it alone. Mr. Davis was here, and he had no intention of letting Jake fall. He wasn't just an attorney. He was something more, a lifeline in a sea of uncertainty. As the judge continued to drone on, Jake's thoughts went to Emily. He couldn't wait to tell her what was happening. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he wasn't the only one who believed in himself. And as the courtroom fell into silence, Jake sat straighter in his chair. He wasn't going to let this trial define him. Not when there was so much more at stake. This wasn't just about a mistake. It was about proving to the world, and to himself, that he could rise above it all. The judge called for a recess, but Jake's mind was already racing, filled with a determination he hadn't felt in a long time. He had a chance. Maybe, just maybe, things were going to be different. Jake's fingers tightened around the edge of the wooden chair. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. Jake barely slept the night before his next court session. His mind had been a whirlwind of thoughts, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. He hadn't expected to find comfort in the presence of someone like Mr. Davis, someone who had appeared out of nowhere but seemed to understand that Jake needed more than just a lawyer. He needed someone to believe in him when everyone else, even the judge, seemed determined to tear him down. But Jake wasn't naive. He knew that Mr. Davis wasn't some miracle worker. The odds were stacked against him. The evidence, even though shaky, seemed to suggest that Jake had been responsible for the vandalism. The security footage wasn't clear, but it showed a shadowy figure matching Jake's build walking around the lab just before the damage was done. It wasn't proof, but it was enough to make everyone assume the worst. That night, he spent hours tossing and turning, trying to find an explanation for the mess he'd found himself in. He tried to remember anything from that day, but his mind was a blur. Could he have been in the wrong place at the wrong time? Had he been framed? He didn't have the answers. But one thing he knew for sure, he couldn't give up. Not now. Not after everything Mr. Davis had done for him so far. The next morning, Jake arrived at the courthouse early. The lobby was quiet, and he took a seat in the corner, his hands trembling. He could already feel the weight of the day pressing down on him. The air was thick with anticipation, and Jake couldn't shake the feeling that this was the calm before the storm. Mr. Davis showed up a few minutes later, his presence immediately drawing attention as he strode into the room with purpose. He was carrying a briefcase, his face a mask of concentration as he glanced at the documents inside. He didn't acknowledge Jake right away, but when their eyes met, the faintest smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "You ready for today?" Mr. Davis asked, his voice low but steady. Jake nodded, swallowing hard. "I don't know. I'm still trying to figure out how this happened." Mr. Davis gave him a reassuring look. "That's exactly why I'm here. We're going to find the truth, Jake. We're going to prove that you didn't do this." Jake wasn't sure how Mr. Davis could be so confident, but there was something about his unwavering belief that kept Jake from completely falling apart. If anyone could turn this around, it was him. As the doors to the courtroom opened, they both stood up, walking toward the proceedings with a shared sense of determination. The judge, already seated, glanced at his watch impatiently. "I trust we're ready to begin," he grumbled, giving Mr. Davis an annoyed look. "Let's make this quick." Jake could feel the tension in the air the moment they stepped inside. The opposing lawyer, a stiff-looking man named Mr. Clarkson, shot him a brief, dismissive glance. Clarkson had already made it clear that he believed Jake was guilty. He didn't even bother to hide his contempt as he looked at Jake, as though the young man were nothing more than a nuisance to be dealt with. But Jake wasn't paying attention to Clarkson. His focus was on Mr. Davis, who had already begun to pace back and forth in front of the judge's bench, speaking in calm, measured tones. "Your Honor," Mr. Davis began, his voice steady but firm, "we're here today not to dwell on accusations, but to expose the truth. The evidence presented so far is circumstantial at best. The prosecution wants you to believe that my client, Jake Thompson, is responsible for the damage done to the computer lab. But I'm here to show that the facts don't add up." The judge raised an eyebrow, his expression skeptical. "Mr. Davis, I've seen the footage. What part of it doesn't add up?" Mr. Davis stopped pacing and turned to face the judge, his eyes sharp. "I'm glad you asked, Your Honor. The footage is blurry and inconclusive. It shows a figure that could be anyone. It doesn't show Jake Thompson's face clearly. And we can't ignore the fact that the security cameras were poorly positioned in the lab. They don't provide enough information to definitively prove my client's involvement. The judge didn't seem convinced, but Mr. Davis continued, undeterred. And then, there's the motive. The prosecution suggests that Jake, for some unknown reason, decided to destroy school property. But that's simply not the case. Jake has no history of violence or aggression. In fact, he's a well-liked student, known for his quiet demeanor and strong academic performance. The judge muttered something under his breath, clearly unconvinced. All right, Mr. Davis. But the facts are what they are. You'll have to do better than this if you expect me to dismiss the charges. Mr. Davis nodded calmly, acknowledging the judge's skepticism without backing down. I will, Your Honor. But first, I would like to call a witness to the stand. The tension in the room shifted as the courtroom doors opened again, and a new figure stepped inside. Jake's heart skipped a beat when he saw who it was. Emily. She walked with her usual confidence, her head held high, as she made her way to the witness stand. Jake could hardly believe his eyes. What was she doing here? Mr. Davis had mentioned something about calling witnesses, but Jake hadn't expected Emily to be one of them. He knew she had nothing to do with the vandalism, but what could she possibly say that would help him? As she took the stand and was sworn in, Jake could barely focus on the questions being asked. His mind was still reeling from the surprise of seeing her here. She didn't need to be involved in this, she had her own life, her own future to worry about. Why had she chosen to help him? But when Emily spoke, it was clear she had come prepared. Jake Thompson didn't do this, she said firmly, her voice steady, though Jake could see the strain in her eyes. I've known him for years, and he's not the type of person who would ever destroy something like that. He's been dealing with enough at home as it is. This isn't him. Jake's heart swelled with gratitude and something deeper. How had he ever deserved someone like Emily? Mr. Davis looked over at Jake, giving him a small, encouraging nod before turning back to Emily. Can you describe Jake's character for the court? How would you say he's been handling his life at school and at home? Emily didn't hesitate. Jake is one of the most thoughtful and intelligent people I know. He's always been reserved, but that doesn't mean he's capable of this. He's had a tough time at home, with his mom working all the time, but he's never taken that out on anyone. He's the type of person who would help someone else before helping himself. Her words hit Jake like a ton of bricks. He could feel the heat of his own emotions rising. No one had ever spoken about him this way before, not outside of his small circle. Hearing Emily say those things, hearing her defend him so passionately, it was more than he could handle. It was more than he ever thought possible. The judge seemed to soften, though only slightly. He shifted in his seat, giving Emily a long look. Thank you, Mississippi Thompson. We'll see if the defense can back up these claims. As the session continued, Jake's mind began to race with possibilities. Could this be it? Could Emily's testimony be the turning point he needed? He couldn't be sure. But for the first time since this nightmare began, Jake felt like he might have a chance. And maybe, just maybe, things were starting to turn around. But the battle wasn't over yet. Not by a long shot. The true test was yet to come. The courtroom seemed to pulse with tension, every word spoken by Mr. Davis or the opposing attorney hanging in the air, as if the fate of Jake's future was teetering on the edge of a knife. Jake felt every second weigh on him, his heartbeat in his ears as he glanced from one side of the room to the other, trying to make sense of everything. The trial had already been going on for hours, and with each passing minute, the pressure seemed to mount higher, threatening to crush him under its weight. Emily had finished her testimony, but the impression she left was undeniable. Her voice was steady, her words unwavering. She had painted a picture of Jake as someone who could never have committed such an act, someone who was too deeply grounded in his values to even consider it. Jake's heart swelled with gratitude for her, but a gnawing fear tugged at his insides. Was it enough? Was there truly any chance that the judge would believe her? Mr. Davis had asked her to sit down, offering her a brief but sincere thank you. The defense had taken a step in the right direction, but they still had so much ground to cover. Then, the defense lawyer did something that surprised Jake. He sat down, his calm demeanor shifting to a quiet intensity. Mr. Davis wasn't finished, not by a long shot. He glanced at the prosecutor, who was eyeing him with a look that could cut through steel. "You're certain you don't want to call any further witnesses, Mr. Davis?" the judge asked, his voice sharp. "I do, Your Honor," Mr. Davis responded, his tone confident. "But I want to be careful. The prosecution has already made their case, and now, it's time for the truth to speak for itself." The judge nodded slowly, raising an eyebrow. "Very well. We will proceed with closing statements soon, but I will allow you one more chance to bring in any additional evidence or testimony." Jake swallowed hard. It was now or never. He wasn't sure what Mr. Davis was planning, but he trusted him. Maybe for the first time in his life, he truly felt like he had someone in his corner who wasn't going to let him down. The lawyer's eyes met Jake's for a moment, and a slight nod passed between them. Jake could tell there was something Mr. Davis wasn't saying, something he was keeping close to his chest. The room was still, and Jake's mind raced. His thoughts drifted to his mother, Linda. He knew she couldn't afford to take time off from work to come to the trial. The guilt of knowing she was sacrificing so much for him, her long hours, the worry she must have felt about his future, clung to him, tugging at his resolve. She had always done her best for him. She'd always tried to keep him safe, even though she couldn't protect him from everything. Jake knew she wasn't perfect, but neither was he. And she was here, in spirit, every day, helping him find his way through this mess. But then, Jake's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of Mr. Davis's voice, cutting through the silence in the courtroom. "I'd like to call my final witness to the stand." Jake's stomach churned. A final witness? Who else could possibly help him now? His heart skipped a beat when the door to the courtroom creaked open again. Jake didn't know what he was expecting. It wasn't this. In walked a tall, broad-shouldered man, older than Jake, but not by much, wearing a worn leather jacket and a look of deep frustration in his eyes. His face was weathered, his expression hardened. It was the last person Jake would ever expect to see in a courtroom. "Jake," the man said, his voice hoarse. "It's me. Your dad." Jake felt the floor fall out beneath him. There was no way. No way this was happening. His father, who had abandoned them years ago, was standing in front of him, in a courtroom, of all places. His mind spun, and for a moment, everything went silent. He hadn't seen or heard from his father since he was a child. The memories were fuzzy, but the pain of abandonment was sharp. Jake hadn't even known if his father was still alive. And now, here he was, stepping into the chaos of Jake's life as though he'd never left. The murmurs in the courtroom were immediate, people exchanged confused glances, unsure of how to react. Even the judge, who had seen many strange things in his career, was caught off guard. "Your Honor," Mr. Davis began, his voice steady, "I know this may come as a surprise to the court, but this man has a crucial role to play in today's proceedings. He's here because he has information that could change the course of this trial." Jake was paralyzed in his seat, unable to move or speak. His heart hammered in his chest, his throat tightening with emotions he couldn't name. His father? Here. Why now? Why after all these years? The judge, still clearly shocked, nodded slowly. "Proceed, Mr. Davis." Jake's father, his biological father, the man who had vanished from their lives, took a seat in the witness chair. His eyes met Jake's briefly, but there was no apology in his gaze, no sign that he was aware of the damage he'd done by leaving them. He didn't even seem to care. "Mr. Thompson," Mr. Davis said, addressing the man across from him, "can you tell us where you were on the night of the vandalism in question?" The question hung in the air, sharp and direct. Jake's mind was racing, his body frozen in disbelief. This wasn't just a twist. This was something much more, something deeper, something personal. Could his father's sudden appearance be part of a larger plan? "I was at a bar," Jake's father answered curtly. "But that's not important. What matters is that I know my son didn't do this. He's no criminal." The words were like a slap to Jake's face. His father didn't seem apologetic for abandoning him and his mom, but at least he was here now, claiming that Jake wasn't guilty. Jake's mind reeled. For a moment, it felt as though everything he knew about his past was unraveling. He didn't know whether to feel betrayed, relieved, or just plain confused. This wasn't how he had imagined things turning out. Mr. Davis continued, his voice calm but insistent. "Mr. Thompson, can you explain why you're willing to speak up now, after so many years?" Jake's father shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his hands gripping the edge of the witness stand. I know I wasn't there when you needed me, kid. And I don't deserve your forgiveness. But this isn't about me. This is about you. I'm here because you don't deserve this. You don't deserve to be stuck in the mess that I caused. I'm not asking you to forgive me. But I can't let you be punished for something you didn't do." Jake felt a wave of disbelief wash over him. For years, he had wondered if his father even cared. And now, in this courtroom, in front of everyone, he was finally admitting it. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. The judge's stern expression softened for a fraction of a second, as if even he could sense the gravity of the situation. The prosecutor, however, looked furious, his face reddening as he exchanged heated whispers with his colleague. Jake barely heard the rest of the testimony. His world had been turned upside down, and he wasn't sure if he could even process it. But one thing was certain, his life was changing. And with this sudden revelation, his future might just be taking an unexpected turn. The game had shifted. And now, it was time for Jake to find out what the next move was. Jake's world seemed to be tilting, as though everything he thought he understood about his past and present was shifting with every passing moment. His father, who had walked out of their lives so many years ago, was now sitting in front of him in a courtroom, testifying on his behalf. And yet, instead of feeling a rush of relief, Jake felt a wave of confusion and anger rise within him. How was he supposed to feel about this man now? The man who had abandoned him and his mother when Jake had needed him the most. The man who had left them with nothing but empty promises and silence. Jake's mind raced as Mr. Davis continued to ask Jake's father questions, trying to establish the importance of his testimony. But Jake couldn't focus on the details. His head was spinning. All he could think about was how his father's presence in this courtroom was the last thing he'd ever expected. And yet, here he was, testifying that Jake hadn't committed the crime. The judge cleared his throat, pulling Jake out of his thoughts. "Mr. Thompson," he said, his tone slightly softer than before, "your testimony has been noted. We will take a brief recess before proceeding with the closing statements. Mr. Clarkson, are you ready with your arguments?" The prosecutor, Mr. Clarkson, didn't respond immediately. Instead, he glanced at Jake's father with a look of disdain, then back to the judge. "Your Honor, while I'm sure this new testimony is an attempt to confuse the matter, it doesn't change the facts we've presented. The evidence against the defendant is clear." Jake's father shifted uncomfortably in his seat, as if sensing the tension in the room. Jake, however, was struggling with the emotional weight of it all. He had always imagined this moment, his father returning to claim some semblance of redemption, but now that it was happening, he didn't know how to feel. The flood of emotions overwhelmed him. Mr. Davis, however, remained unfazed. He was calm, collected, and determined. He addressed the judge. "Your Honor, if I may, I request that we proceed with the closing statements now. We've presented everything that's relevant, and it's time for the court to see the bigger picture." The judge nodded, signaling the break. "Very well. We will resume in 30 minutes. The courtroom doors opened, and the murmur of voices filled the space. Jake's eyes locked with his father's for a fleeting moment. He wanted to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. His father wasn't the man Jake had always imagined him to be, and now, Jake didn't know how to reconcile the image he'd carried for years with the man sitting in front of him. Mr. Davis gave Jake a nod before turning to speak to his father. "We'll talk after this, okay? Let's not lose focus." Jake wanted to say something, but instead, he just nodded. There was too much going on, too many questions swirling around in his mind. Emily walked over to him during the recess. She looked at him with a soft, understanding expression, though Jake could see the concern in her eyes. She sat down beside him, her voice quiet but steady. "You okay?" she asked, her tone gentle, though it was clear that she was concerned for him. Jake looked up at her, trying to shake off the overwhelming flood of emotions. "I don't know. I don't know what to think anymore. My father, why is he here? After all these years, why now? What does it even mean?" Emily reached out and placed a hand on his arm, offering what little comfort she could in that moment. "Maybe it means he's trying to do the right thing. Maybe he's realizing that you need him, even if it's too little, too late. But, Jake, you need to focus on what's happening now. We'll figure out what it all means later." Jake looked down at his hands, gripping them together as the weight of everything seemed to bear down on him. Emily was right. He had to focus on the trial. But part of him couldn't shake the idea that his father's appearance wasn't just a twist of fate, it was something bigger, something that had the potential to change everything. As the recess continued, Jake watched his father across the room, sitting in the back, his posture stiff and his gaze distant. It wasn't lost on Jake that the man who had abandoned him was now standing in defense of his innocence. But it wasn't just that, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that his father was hiding something. The look in his eyes, the way he avoided any direct confrontation with Jake, it all seemed too calculated. "What do you think?" Jake muttered under his breath, not expecting Emily to hear him. "About your dad?" she asked quietly, her expression thoughtful. "I don't know, Jake. I think it's complicated. He's here, which is more than he's ever done. But he's not exactly showing you that he's sorry, is he?" Jake shook his head, feeling a knot form in his stomach. "No. He's not. It's like he's just here because it's convenient. Because it suits him." Emily sighed softly, squeezing his arm. "You don't owe him anything, Jake. You've done this on your own. You've fought this fight without him, and that's something to be proud of. Whether he's here or not, this trial isn't about him. It's about you." Jake nodded, grateful for her support, but still, the questions in his heart remained unanswered. What was his father really after? Why had he appeared now, when it seemed like Jake's future was already hanging in the balance? The sound of the gavel snapping him out of his thoughts, the judge calling everyone back to their seats. The tension in the room was palpable, and Jake couldn't help but feel a heavy weight on his chest as they prepared for the final arguments. Mr. Clarkson, the prosecutor, stood up first, addressing the court with a practiced calm. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Clarkson began, "we've heard a lot of talk today. But let's not forget the facts. Jake Thompson was seen on security footage near the scene of the crime. His actions are suspicious, and there is no credible evidence to suggest anyone else was responsible. The defense's last-ditch efforts to throw doubt into this case are just that, efforts to avoid the truth." Jake's heart pounded in his chest as Clarkson spoke, each word adding to the overwhelming pressure that had built up since the trial began. The prosecutor didn't even seem concerned that the defense had presented a potential alibi. Clarkson was sticking to his story. "Jake Thompson," Clarkson continued, "is guilty. And I ask you to deliver a verdict that reflects that truth." The room grew still after Clarkson finished speaking. Jake's eyes shifted to Mr. Davis, who was standing, preparing for his own closing statement. Jake didn't know what would come next, but he knew that whatever happened, this was the moment that would shape his life. The truth had to come out now. Mr. Davis stood tall, his voice cutting through the tension in the room. He had no time to waste, and he wasn't going to let Jake down. "Your Honor," Mr. Davis said, his voice filled with conviction, "I stand before you today not to prove that Jake Thompson is innocent, but to prove that the prosecution has not provided a single shred of irrefutable evidence against him. What we have here is speculation, not proof. What we have here is a young man, who has never broken the law, who has never been anything but kind, intelligent, and responsible, caught in a web of circumstances that he did not create. And for that, he should not be punished." The courtroom was silent as Mr. Davis looked directly at the judge, his words hanging in the air. "Jake Thompson deserves the chance to live his life, free from the weight of this accusation. We ask you to consider the evidence, or the lack thereof, and find him not guilty." The moment of truth had arrived. The tension in the courtroom was unbearable. It felt as though time itself had come to a standstill. Jake sat motionless, staring straight ahead, his hands clenched tightly together. He could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on him, especially the jury. The atmosphere was thick with uncertainty, and for the first time in his life, Jake wasn't sure whether he would ever escape the shadow that loomed over him. Mr. Davis had finished his closing statement, and now, the jury had left the room to deliberate. Jake could feel every second stretching out as the clock ticked slowly. Each passing moment seemed to heighten the pressure on his chest. Would they believe him? Would they believe his father? Could they see past the accusations and see the truth? It had been hours since the jury had filed out to deliberate. Jake had no idea what they were discussing, but the doubt gnawed at him like a relentless beast. The waiting was unbearable. Emily sat beside him, her hand resting gently on his arm, as though her touch could offer him some form of comfort. She hadn't said much during the break, but Jake could sense her concern. She was trying to be strong for him, even though she was just as anxious. "Jake, you've done everything you can," she whispered, trying to reassure him. "You've fought hard, and you have the right people in your corner. Now we just have to trust the jury to see the truth." He nodded but didn't respond. He couldn't bring himself to voice his own fears. What if the jury didn't see things the way Mr. Davis had? What if they saw him as just another troubled teenager, guilty before they even looked at the evidence? His father's presence in the courtroom kept rattling around in his mind. The man had walked out on them so many years ago. And yet, today, he was standing there, trying to redeem himself, trying to claim that Jake was innocent. But Jake didn't know what to make of it. Was his father really trying to help, or was there some other agenda behind his sudden appearance? Jake had so many questions that no one could answer, but the one that stung the most was simple: why now? His father had left him, left Linda, and yet now, he was back, offering a defense that Jake wasn't sure was for him or for his own guilt. The sound of the door creaking open interrupted his thoughts. His heart skipped a beat. The jury was returning. Jake's breath caught in his throat as he watched them file in, each of their faces unreadable. The judge stood and nodded to the foreperson of the jury, who slowly stood to announce the decision. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Jake Thompson, guilty as charged," the foreperson's voice rang out. Jake's world shattered in an instant. The words felt like they'd been carved into his soul with a jagged knife. He couldn't believe it. This wasn't the outcome he had prepared for. It was all supposed to be over. It was supposed to be over. His mind raced, his thoughts swirling in confusion and disbelief. Emily gasped softly, her hand tightening around his. Her eyes widened with shock, but she quickly turned her gaze toward him, trying to offer a semblance of support, though it was clear she was struggling to hide her own pain. Jake's father, sitting across the room, had a blank expression on his face. He didn't seem surprised, and for the first time, Jake wondered if his father had known all along that things might turn out this way. Was this why he had come forward? Was he trying to make it easier for Jake to accept the inevitable? The judge's voice cut through the silence, his tone formal and detached. "Mr. Thompson, you are hereby sentenced to 25 years in prison for the crime of vandalism and public disturbance. You have the right to appeal." Jake's body went cold. The world seemed to tilt once again, but this time it was different. He wasn't sure what hurt more, the fact that he was being sentenced to prison, or the gut-wrenching realization that the justice system had failed him. The room seemed to blur, and Jake's mind went quiet for a few moments as the words sank in. He could feel his heart beating in his chest, each thud echoing in his ears. This wasn't supposed to happen. It wasn't supposed to end like this. "Jake," Emily whispered, her voice shaking, "you have to stay strong. You still have options. We'll find a way. You can appeal. We'll fight this." But the words didn't feel real. What was the point of fighting a system that had already made up its mind? The jury's verdict was final. The judge's sentence was final. No matter how much Emily believed in him, there was nothing they could do to change it now. As Jake was led out of the courtroom, handcuffed and surrounded by officers, he felt as though he was being dragged into an entirely new world. The weight of the metal cuffs on his wrists felt heavy, each step dragging him further away from the life he thought he had known. He wasn't just losing his freedom, he was losing everything. And all he could do was watch as his future slipped through his fingers. But through the fog of his thoughts, there was one thing he couldn't shake, the image of his father's face as the verdict was read. He hadn't been surprised. Why? Did he know the outcome before it even happened? The questions continued to race in Jake's mind. But the answers seemed further away than ever. The sound of metal clinking echoed through the cold, sterile hallway as Jake was escorted down the long corridor of the county jail. His footsteps felt heavier with each step, as though the weight of the world had settled on his shoulders. The harsh fluorescent lights above flickered occasionally, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The chill in the air matched the emptiness in his chest, as though a part of him had been lost with the verdict. Jake didn't speak. There was nothing left to say. The world had tilted on its axis, and he had been thrown into a place he never thought he'd be, alone, confused, and trapped. He thought about his mother, Linda. She'd been in the courtroom, her face pale and tear-streaked, but she hadn't said a word. She'd stayed strong, perhaps for him, or maybe because she didn't know how to react to the reality of it all. Jake couldn't blame her. He didn't know how to react either. Everything that had led to this moment felt like a blur, like a bad dream that he couldn't wake up from. As the officers pushed open the heavy door to his holding cell, Jake was hit with the reality of his new life. The room was bare, save for a narrow cot in the corner and a small, grated window high up on the wall. The cell smelled faintly of mildew and something more bitter, hopelessness. The door slammed shut behind him with a finality that made Jake's heart skip a beat. He was locked in. Alone. For how long? He didn't know. The world outside seemed so distant now. His life, his future, had been ripped away from him in an instant, and nothing seemed to make sense anymore. His mind kept returning to the trial, the jury, the verdict. Guilty as charged. He couldn't shake the words, no matter how hard he tried. They echoed in his mind like a constant reminder of his failure. But was it really a failure? Was he really guilty? The thought made him sick. The memories of his father, his sudden return to the courtroom, his quiet demeanor, his lack of emotion as the verdict was read, haunted him. He couldn't understand it. Was his father playing some game? Was he manipulating Jake, using him to fix his own past mistakes? Or had he truly been trying to help? But it was too late for answers now. The door to his cell slammed open once more, and Jake's thoughts were interrupted. A guard stood at the entrance, his face expressionless. "Time for a phone call," the guard said, his voice flat and impersonal. Jake blinked, his mind slow to process the information. "A phone call," he repeated, as though the concept itself was foreign to him. Yeah. You get one call. Make it quick, the guard said, stepping aside to allow Jake to move toward the phone in the corner. Jake hesitated, his heart pounding. Who would he even call? Who could help him now? He thought about his mother, but she was probably too overwhelmed. Maybe Emily. But she was likely just as lost as he was. The only person who might have any insight into how to fix this was Mr. Davis. But he wasn't sure if calling his lawyer would help at all. He approached the phone, glancing over his shoulder at the guard, who stood with his arms crossed, waiting for Jake to make his decision. The phone felt like a lifeline, but also a burden. Whoever he called had to know what was happening, and Jake didn't want to burden anyone more than he already had. Taking a deep breath, Jake picked up the receiver and dialed the only number that felt remotely familiar, his mother's cell. The phone rang several times before it was picked up. Jake's heart rate quickened as he waited. When his mother's voice finally came through, it sounded small, as though it had been swallowed by the distance between them. Jake. Linda's voice trembled. Jake, are you okay? I can't believe this is happening. I don't know what to do. I don't know how to make this better. Jake's throat tightened. He wanted to tell her everything would be okay, that it wasn't over. But how could he lie to her when everything felt so hopeless? Instead, he just let out a shaky breath. Mom, I don't know what happened, he whispered. I don't know why this is happening. There was a long pause, and then he heard the sound of her trying to suppress a sob. I don't know either, Jake. I just want you home. But this is real. You're in jail. How did it come to this? Jake closed his eyes, his mind flashing back to the trial, to his father's testimony, to the moment when he had heard the words, guilty, and felt his whole world crumble. I don't know, Mom. I'm sorry. I don't know what I'm supposed to do now. His mother's voice softened. You don't have to apologize. You didn't do this. We'll figure this out. We have to. I love you, Jake. You're not alone. We'll fight this. The words were comforting, but they didn't take away the gnawing feeling in Jake's gut. What if they couldn't fight it? What if this was the end? What if this was the start of a whole new life, a life behind bars? I love you too, Mom, Jake whispered, feeling the lump in his throat grow bigger. He didn't know what to say next. There was nothing more to say. The truth was, he was scared. He didn't know how to get out of this mess. But before he could say another word, the guard's voice cut through the conversation. Time's up, the guard said, his tone indicating he wasn't interested in any further delay. Jake's heart sank as he looked at the receiver in his hand. His conversation with his mother had been brief, but it was enough to remind him of what he was losing. I'll call you again, okay, he said quickly, before the guard could cut him off. Linda's voice came through one last time, desperate but reassuring. Jake, don't give up. We'll figure this out, I promise. Just hang in there. But Jake didn't know how much longer he could hang on. As the guard ushered him back toward his cell, Jake felt the weight of his future bearing down on him, suffocating him with every step. Alone again, Jake sat on the edge of his cot. The fluorescent lights above buzzed incessantly, a constant reminder that time was passing, and with it, his chances of freedom slipping further away. His thoughts circled back to his father. Had his father come back to try to save him, or had he come to tie up loose ends for himself? And most importantly, why hadn't his father been the one to speak up when it truly mattered? Jake didn't know what the answers were, but one thing was certain, the trial wasn't the end of his story. He had no idea what came next, but he couldn't give up yet. Not while there was still a chance to make things right. The fight wasn't over. Not yet. The days blurred into each other. The harsh clanging of metal doors, the cold concrete floors, and the never-ending hum of fluorescent lights became the backdrop to Jake's life in the county jail. Time seemed to lose all meaning as he spent his days pacing in the small, sterile cell, his thoughts drifting endlessly between confusion, anger, and fear. But there was a small flicker of something else, something that Jake wasn't sure how to categorize: hope. A single, faint thread of hope began to weave itself into his otherwise dark existence. It started with a knock on his cell door, which seemed almost too good to be true. "Thompson," the voice of the guard called through the door. "You got a visitor." Jake's heart leapt into his throat. A visitor? Who could it be? His mother? Emily? Maybe even Mr. Davis? He stood up quickly, his mind racing as the door to his cell opened. The guard motioned for him to step out, and Jake obeyed without hesitation. His eyes scanned the small waiting area, but the only person standing there was someone he hadn't expected to see: his father. "Jake," his father said, his voice thick with emotion. I'm sorry for everything." Jake froze, his heart sinking in his chest. There were so many emotions swirling inside him, it was impossible to sort through them all. He hadn't seen his father in years, and here he was now, standing in front of him, looking much older and more worn than Jake remembered. "What do you want?" Jake's voice was sharp, though he couldn't stop the tremor that ran through it. "I know I've made a mess of things," his father replied, his eyes lowering in shame. "But I came here to tell you that I'm going to fix this." Jake's breath caught in his throat. Fix this? His father hadn't been there when things fell apart, so what did he mean now by fixing it? "You think you can fix this?" Jake spat, his anger rising. "You walked out on us. You left me with Mom and never looked back, and now, when everything's already fallen apart, you show up, acting like you can fix everything." His father flinched but didn't retreat. "I'm not asking for forgiveness, Jake. I know I've failed you. But I'm here now because I can still help. I'm not going to let them lock you away." Jake stared at him, disbelief written all over his face. Was this some kind of cruel joke? Did his father really think he could just waltz back into his life after abandoning him for all these years and magically make things better? Why now? Why the hell are you here now, after everything? Jake's voice cracked as he finally let out the frustration he had been holding in. "Do you even care about me at all, or are you just trying to ease your own guilt?" "I care, Jake," his father replied, his voice softening. "I've always cared. I just didn't know how to show it back then. But I've spent the last few years trying to figure it out. And I want to make it right for you, whatever it takes." Jake's anger flared again, but this time, it was mixed with confusion. How could he believe him? How could he trust someone who had never been there for him? For a long moment, they stood there, neither of them speaking. The tension between them was palpable, thick and suffocating. But as the silence dragged on, something shifted inside Jake. Despite everything, despite all his doubts and the years of hurt, part of him wanted to believe his father. He wanted to believe that maybe, just maybe, he could still fix things. "What are you going to do?" Jake asked, his voice quieter now, but still laced with skepticism. "I've contacted a lawyer," his father said, his gaze unwavering. "We're going to file an appeal. We'll show that the evidence was incomplete, that you didn't get a fair trial. You didn't deserve that verdict." Jake looked at him, studying his face for any sign of deceit. He wanted to believe his father. He wanted to believe that there was still a chance for things to change, but the years of abandonment and the sharp sting of betrayal held him back. "An appeal? But the jury already found me guilty. It's over." "It's not over yet," his father said firmly. "I've been working with some people who believe in your innocence. You didn't do this, Jake. And we're going to prove it." Jake swallowed hard, torn between hope and the deep-rooted fear that it was all too late. Could he really trust his father? Could he rely on this man, who had been absent for so long, to help him out of this nightmare? "I don't know if I can trust you," Jake muttered, his eyes avoiding his father's gaze. "I don't expect you to forgive me right away," his father replied quietly. "But I promise you, I'm here to fight for you. I'm not going anywhere this time." Jake felt a strange mix of emotions: anger, relief, confusion, and, deep down, something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. It was faint, fragile, but it was there. He didn't know if his father's promises would come true. But at that moment, it felt like a small crack in the wall of his despair. For the first time in days, Jake allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was a chance to turn this around. Later that night, as Jake lay on his cot staring at the ceiling, his mind raced. He replayed the conversation with his father over and over, trying to make sense of it all. Was it a fresh start, or just another false hope? He couldn't decide. But as the minutes ticked by, the idea of fighting back, of proving his innocence, began to settle in his chest like a seed of determination. Maybe the journey ahead would be long, and maybe it wouldn't be easy. But he wasn't going to give up. For the first time in a long while, Jake allowed himself to dream of what life might be like on the other side of this nightmare. And even though he didn't know what the future held, he knew one thing for sure: he wasn't going to face it alone. He had his father back. And for better or worse, they were going to fight this together. The morning after Jake's unexpected visit from his father, the jail felt even colder, the concrete floors even harder. As Jake sat at the small metal table in his cell, he couldn't shake the tension that had built up in his chest overnight. His father's words echoed in his mind: "We'll prove it, Jake. We'll show them you didn't do this." It was hard for Jake to believe, but part of him couldn't help but grasp at the lifeline his father had thrown him, no matter how frayed it seemed. The news of the appeal had spread quickly. Word in the jail had a way of traveling, and within hours, inmates were whispering about Jake's case, some offering sympathetic glances, others murmuring that he might have a shot at getting out. He didn't know what to believe anymore. The idea of an appeal was daunting. After the jury had convicted him, it seemed impossible that anything could change. But his father was determined. Jake couldn't deny that. The day passed slowly, each minute dragging like hours. Jake found himself counting the seconds as he sat in his cell, staring blankly at the wall. It wasn't until late in the afternoon that the door to his cell opened once again. The guard stood in the doorway, looking at Jake with a neutral expression. "Thompson," the guard said, his voice curt. "Your lawyer's here." Jake's heart leapt. Mr. Davis. He had no idea what his lawyer could do at this point. Everything had seemed hopeless. But maybe there was a chance. He stood up quickly, his movements jerky, as he walked out of his cell and down the cold corridor. The visit room was a small, grim place: one table, 2 chairs, and a thick pane of glass separating the inmates from their visitors. Jake's nerves buzzed in the quiet space as he sat down across from Mr. Davis, who was already there waiting, a file in front of him. "Jake," Mr. Davis greeted him with a small nod, his tone professional, but there was a glint of something else in his eyes, something that wasn't quite as detached as usual. "We need to talk strategy. I've been reviewing your case." Jake felt a flicker of hope. He hadn't realized how much he needed this: someone to believe in him, someone to lay out a plan. He leaned forward, listening intently as Mr. Davis continued. "We've got a few options," Mr. Davis began, flipping through the stack of papers in front of him. "I've already started working on the appeal, but it won't be easy. The evidence against you is pretty damning, especially with the jury's verdict. However, there's always a chance, Jake. We'll need to prove that the prosecution didn't present the case fairly, that the trial was flawed in some way." Jake's stomach tightened at the mention of the trial. He still couldn't fully process what had happened, but he remembered the feeling of helplessness, of being painted as a criminal when all he'd wanted was to be believed. He had to focus, to keep himself together if there was even a small chance to make it out of this. "What kind of flaws are we talking about?" Jake asked, his voice low. Mr. Davis adjusted his glasses before answering, his tone measured. One key area I want to focus on is the way the prosecution handled your father's testimony. There was a lot of ambiguity in what he said, and it was never fully examined by your defense team. If we can show that his testimony was mishandled or that it caused confusion, it might be grounds for a new trial. Jake's mind raced. His father's testimony had been one of the most confusing parts of the trial. Jake still didn't know why his father had shown up or what exactly his testimony had meant. The idea that it could be used to his advantage now felt almost impossible. "You're saying that my father's testimony could be the key?" Jake asked cautiously. "Potentially," Mr. Davis replied, his fingers tapping lightly on the file in front of him. "But it's going to take some work. We'll need to get a forensic expert to review everything. We'll also need to look at any potential mistakes the prosecution made during the trial, procedural errors, missed opportunities, anything we can use to our advantage." Jake nodded, absorbing everything Mr. Davis was saying. This was more than he'd expected. There was a plan. There was something they could do. But part of him still wondered how much of this was wishful thinking. He had a hard time believing that his father's shaky testimony could be the key to his freedom. "What else?" Jake asked, trying to focus on the details, on anything that might give him a clearer path. Mr. Davis leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "We'll also need to work on gathering more evidence to show that you didn't have a motive for what you were accused of. The prosecution painted you as someone with a clear reason to commit the crime. We need to dismantle that narrative. We need to show that the idea of you committing this crime was completely unfounded." The mention of motive hit Jake like a punch to the stomach. Why had they thought he had a motive? His mind flashed to the trial, to the prosecutor's accusations. He had been framed, but how could they prove that? Mr. Davis seemed to sense his frustration. "I know it sounds difficult. But it's not impossible, Jake. We've got a long road ahead of us, but I want you to stay strong. We're going to do everything we can to clear your name." Jake clenched his fists, trying to push down the overwhelming mix of emotions that threatened to spill over. The desire for justice, the hope that he could clear his name, mixed with the fear that it would all fall apart again. But Mr. Davis was right. This wasn't over. "All right," Jake said, his voice steadying as he looked at his lawyer. "I'm in. Do whatever you need to do." Mr. Davis gave him a reassuring smile, though it was tinged with the understanding that the road ahead would be long and uncertain. "We'll get to work immediately. Stay strong, Jake. This isn't over. Not by a long shot." That evening, after the meeting with Mr. Davis, Jake sat in his cell, the flicker of hope in his chest growing just a little brighter. The path ahead wasn't clear, and there would be setbacks, no doubt. But for the first time in a long while, he felt like there was something he could do. He could fight. He wasn't alone in this anymore. And that realization, small as it was, brought with it a renewed sense of determination. Jake wasn't going to give up. Not now, not ever. The fight for his freedom had only just begun. The next few weeks in jail were a blur for Jake. Each day felt like the last, monotonous, repetitive, and filled with the weight of uncertainty. He spent his time pacing his cell or talking to his lawyer whenever possible. The hope that Mr. Davis had given him kept him going, but it was hard to ignore the creeping doubts that lingered in the back of his mind. Every time he saw the cold walls of his cell, he wondered if the chance to escape this nightmare was just another illusion. Still, the work was happening. Mr. Davis and his team had dug deep into every part of Jake's case. They were in contact with forensic experts, reviewing every detail, every shred of evidence that had been presented during the trial. There was no stone left unturned. But Jake had to admit, he couldn't see the endgame yet. He didn't know what was really happening behind the scenes, and that uncertainty gnawed at him every minute of every day. Then, on a morning that started like any other, there was another knock at his cell door. "Thompson, you've got another visitor." Jake stood up quickly, his heart racing. Could it be his father again? Or maybe Mr. Davis had some new information to share. He walked out of his cell, the anticipation building with each step. When he entered the visitation area, he was surprised to see someone new, a tall woman in a sharp suit, her dark hair pulled back into a neat ponytail. She looked like someone who knew exactly what she was doing, and there was an air of professionalism about her that immediately caught Jake's attention. "Jake Thompson?" she asked, her voice calm, but there was a sharpness to it. Jake nodded, unsure of what to expect. "I'm Sarah Hayes," she introduced herself, taking a seat across from him. "I'm a private investigator. I've been working with your lawyer, Mr. Davis, on your case." Jake felt a flicker of recognition. He'd heard about private investigators helping with cases like his, but he'd never imagined he'd meet one. His curiosity piqued, he leaned forward, eager to hear what she had to say. "What's going on?" Jake asked, his voice tinged with desperation. "I've been waiting for any kind of news, any kind of progress." Sarah smiled faintly, but there was no hiding the seriousness of the situation in her eyes. "We've been digging into your case, Jake. And I've uncovered something that might change everything." Jake's heart skipped a beat. Something that could change everything? Was this it? Had they found something to prove his innocence? "What did you find?" Jake asked, barely able to contain his excitement. Sarah didn't waste any time. She opened the folder in front of her and pulled out a series of photographs, placing them on the table between them. Jake leaned forward, squinting at the pictures. They were blurry, but he could make out shapes and outlines. At first, nothing seemed to jump out at him. "These were taken by a security camera near the scene of the crime," Sarah explained, tapping one of the photos. "They weren't in the police report, at least, not the full footage. But we found the original footage that had been tampered with." Jake's stomach turned. Tampered with? He had no idea what she meant. "What do you mean, tampered with?" he asked, his voice strained. Sarah's expression grew more serious. The police investigation had overlooked several key pieces of evidence. "In the footage we recovered, you're clearly not in the area where the crime took place at the time it was supposed to have occurred. In fact, based on the timestamp, you were miles away at the time. But that part of the footage was cut from the original report." Jake felt a rush of disbelief. This was huge. If what Sarah was saying was true, it could completely change the narrative of the case. "Wait," Jake said, trying to process the information. "Are you saying I have an alibi?" Sarah nodded, her gaze steady. "Exactly. The footage places you elsewhere at the time of the crime. But here's the kicker, the prosecution knew about this footage, but they never included it in their case. They had a version of the video that was edited, one that conveniently left out the parts that could have exonerated you." Jake's mind raced. This was what he'd been hoping for, the evidence he needed to prove his innocence. But at the same time, he couldn't shake the feeling that something else was at play. Why had the prosecution hidden this? Why didn't they show this in court? Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Because they didn't want the jury to see it," Sarah replied, her voice firm. "They wanted to paint you as guilty, and this footage didn't fit their story. It's not uncommon for this kind of thing to happen, unfortunately. Prosecutors often prioritize a conviction over the truth. But now we have it." Jake stared at the pictures in front of him, the reality of the situation slowly sinking in. For the first time since he was arrested, he began to feel a glimmer of real hope. Maybe it wasn't over after all. "We can use this," Sarah continued, her voice filled with quiet determination. "This footage, combined with the other inconsistencies in your trial, could be the key to getting your case reopened. But it's going to be a fight. The system doesn't like being challenged, especially not when there's a conviction already in place." Jake nodded slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know how long this battle would take, or what the outcome would be. But for the first time in a long while, he felt like there was a path forward. "Thank you," Jake said, his voice raw with emotion. "I don't know what to say. This could change everything." Sarah gave him a small, reassuring smile. "We're just getting started. But we're not giving up on you. Not now, not ever." That night, as Jake lay on his cot, the weight of the day finally began to sink in. He couldn't stop thinking about the footage, about the way the prosecution had intentionally withheld evidence. For the first time in months, Jake allowed himself to imagine a future outside of the cold, gray walls of the jail. The flicker of hope that had been growing inside him suddenly felt like a blazing fire. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. And Jake Thompson was ready to fight for his life. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The days following Jake's meeting with Sarah Hayes were a blur of activity. He was suddenly thrust into the middle of an uphill battle, but for the first time since his conviction, he felt like he had a fighting chance. The footage, the alibi, everything was coming together, piece by piece, but it wasn't going to be easy. Nothing about this situation had ever been easy, and now, the real work had begun. Back at the courthouse, the prosecution was still basking in their victory, convinced that they had locked away a criminal. They had no idea what was coming. Jake's lawyer, Mr. Davis, had already begun working with Sarah, and together, they were preparing to file a motion for a retrial. The prosecution, however, wasn't about to let go of its triumph without a fight. The evidence Sarah had uncovered would be a major blow to their case, and they would fight tooth and nail to suppress it. But Jake wasn't focused on the prosecution's strategies just yet. He was focused on one thing, his own future. The time spent in that cold cell had warped his perception of time. It felt like years had passed since his conviction, and yet, in the grand scheme of things, it had only been a few months. In that time, everything had changed. His life had been taken from him in an instant, but now, he had the chance to take it back. It wasn't long before Jake found himself in the crowded visitation room once more. He had received a letter earlier that day saying that his father would be visiting. The thought of seeing him again made Jake uneasy. His father's testimony had been a huge part of the trial, but the confusion surrounding it still lingered. Jake had to admit, though, that a small part of him was desperate to understand his father's side of the story. What had he meant when he'd spoken in court? Why had his testimony seemed so off? As Jake sat in the visitation room, he anxiously waited for his father to arrive. When the door opened, his father stepped inside, looking almost as tired as Jake felt. His face was lined with stress and worry, but his eyes still held a glimmer of determination. Jake couldn't help but notice the change in his father. The man who had once been a pillar of strength in his life seemed frail, almost broken by the weight of everything that had happened. "Dad," Jake said, standing up from his chair. I wasn't expecting you today." His father smiled weakly, sitting down across from him. "I know, son. I know. But I've been keeping up with everything. I know about the new evidence. And I wanted to see you, to make sure you're okay." Jake sat back down, swallowing hard. "I don't know if I'm okay, Dad. I'm trying, but I don't know what to think anymore. The trial, the conviction, it all still feels like a nightmare." His father's eyes softened. "Jake, I know I haven't been the best father. I've made mistakes. But I've been doing everything I can to help you. I want to make sure you get out of here." Jake's chest tightened. This was the part of his father he hadn't seen in years, the man who cared, who wanted to make things right. But there was still so much between them, so much left unsaid. "I don't understand," Jake muttered, his voice thick with emotion. "Why did you testify the way you did in court? It didn't make any sense. I need to know why you said the things you did. It's like you were on their side." His father's expression faltered, and for a moment, Jake thought he might say something he would regret. But instead, his father simply sighed, his face a mixture of guilt and regret. "I never meant for it to be like that, Jake," his father said quietly. "I never meant for you to feel like I was against you. But I was under pressure, son. They had me cornered, and I didn't know what else to say. I didn't know how to protect you, not then." Jake's heart pounded. He could feel the anger, the betrayal, rising up in his chest. But at the same time, there was something else, something like relief. His father wasn't a traitor. He hadn't intentionally sold him out. But he had been too weak to stand up to the pressure. "Dad, why didn't you tell me this earlier?" Jake asked, his voice trembling with frustration. "You could have helped me. You could have told the truth, but instead, you just let me hang." His father looked down at his hands, ashamed. I know I failed you. But I'm here now, Jake. I'll do whatever it takes to make things right. I'm going to help you get out of here." Jake stared at him, a mixture of emotions flooding his mind. His father was offering him the help he had needed all along. But it was hard to trust someone who had failed him so completely. "I don't know if I can believe you, Dad," Jake said quietly, his voice raw. "But I'll take your help. I don't know what else to do." His father nodded, tears welling up in his eyes. "I won't let you down again. I promise." After the visit, Jake's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. His father's confession, the evidence Sarah had uncovered, everything was falling into place, but there was still so much left to do. The battle was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. Back in his cell, Jake tried to focus. He needed to stay strong. He needed to remember why he was fighting, to clear his name, to prove he was innocent, and to make sure the truth came out. The following weeks were filled with meetings, court filings, and tense phone calls. Mr. Davis and Sarah worked tirelessly, pushing the legal system to reopen Jake's case. Every document, every piece of evidence was meticulously examined, and slowly, it became clear that the prosecution had overlooked, or worse, deliberately hidden, crucial evidence. But Jake knew it wouldn't be enough just to have the evidence. He needed to make sure everyone else knew it too. His case had to be about more than just clearing his name, it had to be about making the system accountable. As the days turned into weeks, Jake continued to brace himself for the battles ahead. But one thing was certain, he wasn't going to give up. The truth was on his side, and he was going to fight for it, no matter what. The air in the courthouse was thick with tension. Jake had been through countless hearings, legal battles, and emotional roller coasters, but this day felt different. Everything had led to this moment, the official filing for a retrial. His lawyer, Mr. Davis, stood at the forefront, fiercely determined, while Jake sat quietly behind him, the weight of the world still pressing on his shoulders. This was the day everything could change, but there was no guarantee. Jake's father was seated in the back of the courtroom, nervously fidgeting with his hands. Jake could tell that his father was just as anxious, but it was the first time in a long while that he had shown up, standing by his son despite the tension between them. The air between them, heavy with unspoken words, was something Jake wasn't sure how to navigate, but it was clear that his father wanted to make amends. The courtroom was filled with the usual suspects, the judge, the prosecutor, the defense attorneys, and a few spectators. The prosecutor, Mrs. Harding, was standing with a smug expression on her face, arms crossed as though she had already won. She had no idea what was about to hit her. The judge, a seasoned man with sharp eyes, glanced at the papers before him and then turned his attention to Mr. Davis. "Mr. Davis," the judge said, his voice stern. "You've requested a retrial based on new evidence. Can you briefly outline what this new evidence is?" Mr. Davis stood, his tall frame making him appear even more authoritative. "Yes, Your Honor. The new evidence pertains to surveillance footage that was intentionally withheld by the prosecution during the original trial. This footage clearly shows that my client, Mr. Jake Thompson, was nowhere near the scene of the crime at the time it occurred. Additionally, we have reason to believe that the prosecution was aware of this footage and chose not to include it in their case. A murmur spread through the courtroom, and even Mrs. Harding looked slightly taken aback. The judge raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "Are you claiming the prosecution withheld evidence?" the judge asked, his voice even but laced with suspicion. "I am," Mr. Davis replied firmly. "We have obtained the full footage, which has been verified by independent experts. It exonerates Mr. Thompson, Your Honor, and we request that you reopen this case for a retrial based on this newly discovered and critical evidence." Mrs. Harding, who had been standing silently, now stepped forward, her face hardening with defiance. "Your Honor," she said, her voice cold, "this is a last-ditch attempt by the defense to muddy the waters. The original trial was fair, and the verdict was justified. The evidence presented at that time was clear, and there's no reason to reopen the case based on claims of tampered footage. We oppose this motion." The tension in the room rose as Harding's words hung in the air. The defense team exchanged a glance, silently agreeing to stand their ground. Jake could feel his pulse racing as the judge turned his attention back to the case at hand. The judge sat back in his chair, steepling his fingers. He was quiet for a long moment, weighing the situation carefully. Jake's stomach churned, the uncertainty clawing at him. What if the judge dismissed their motion? What if it was all for nothing? Finally, the judge spoke, breaking the silence. "I've reviewed the motion and the evidence presented. Based on the new footage and the allegations of prosecutorial misconduct, I believe there is enough cause to reopen this case. A retrial will be scheduled." Jake's heart skipped a beat. It was happening. They were going to have another chance. The flood of relief was overwhelming, but just as quickly, doubt crept in. They'd won the first small battle, but the war was far from over. The judge banged his gavel, and the room erupted into murmurs. Harding shot an angry glance at Mr. Davis but said nothing more. Jake couldn't help but feel a surge of defiance. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. As the courtroom began to empty, Jake's father stood and walked toward him. His expression was serious but hopeful, his eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and a new sense of purpose. "You did good, Jake," his father said, clapping him gently on the shoulder. "You really did." Jake gave a tight smile, unsure of what to say. He had heard those words from his father before, but today they felt different. Maybe this was the start of a new chapter, a step toward healing, not just in his case, but in their relationship, too. In the days that followed, the case began to take shape. Mr. Davis and Sarah Hayes worked tirelessly behind the scenes, preparing for the retrial. They had gathered every shred of evidence they could, ensuring that the new footage would be front and center in the new trial. It wasn't just about proving his innocence anymore, it was about exposing the system for its flaws, for the mistakes it had made when it came to Jake's case. For Jake, it was a time of mixed emotions. The weight of the past few months still hung heavy on his shoulders. Every conversation, every step forward felt like a double-edged sword. He was fighting for his freedom, for his future, but he was also fighting to understand his past. The truth about what had happened at the trial, about his father's role, still hung in the air like an unresolved question. As the date for the retrial approached, Jake found himself once again in his cell, the familiar gray walls around him. But this time, it felt different. There was a sense of purpose in the air. He wasn't just another inmate. He wasn't just a defendant. He was a man with a future, one he could take control of, one step at a time. But with each passing day, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that the next chapter of his life wouldn't be as easy as winning the motion for a retrial. There were still unanswered questions, still obstacles to overcome, and still a relentless system that would fight to keep him locked away. The night before the retrial began, Jake sat alone in his cell, staring at the ceiling. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, but the one thing that stood out was the clarity with which he knew he had to face whatever came next. No matter how hard it would get, no matter the doubts, Jake was ready to fight. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he had control again. The fight wasn't over, but he was more determined than ever to win it. Tomorrow, the battle would continue. And Jake Thompson wasn't going to give up. The morning of the retrial arrived with a heavy, almost suffocating sense of anticipation. Jake could feel it in the air, like a storm that was about to break. As he was led from his cell to the courtroom, every step felt more monumental than the last. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, but there was one thought that kept repeating, "This is it. This is your chance." He was escorted into the same courtroom where he had been wrongfully convicted only months earlier. The air was thick with tension, the weight of what had happened and what was about to unfold. There was no turning back now. His lawyer, Mr. Davis, was already at the defense table, going over his notes one last time. Sarah Hayes was also there, sitting quietly beside him, her expression focused but calm. She had become more than just a lawyer to Jake, she was a symbol of hope, a reminder that there were still people who believed in him, in the truth. She had worked tirelessly alongside Mr. Davis, piecing together the evidence that would hopefully exonerate him once and for all. The prosecution was on the opposite side, led by the same prosecutor, Mrs. Harding. She had a reputation for being tough, relentless, and absolutely convinced that Jake was guilty. The fact that she was now facing a retrial, after her team's failure to disclose crucial evidence, was a slap in the face for her career. But Jake knew that she wasn't going to go down without a fight. He could feel her eyes on him as he entered the room, a look of barely concealed contempt. The judge, a no-nonsense man who had presided over Jake's original trial, entered the courtroom and signaled for everyone to rise. The moment felt surreal to Jake, it was like he was stuck in some sort of dream, one that he wasn't sure was going to end the way he hoped. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. "Ladies and gentlemen," the judge said, his voice firm, "we are here today for the retrial of Jake Thompson. The defense has presented new evidence that may significantly alter the outcome of this case. Both sides will have an opportunity to present their arguments. Mr. Davis, you may proceed." Jake's heart pounded in his chest. This was it, the moment they would present the surveillance footage that could prove his innocence. It was the evidence that had been hidden the first time around, the proof that could set him free. Mr. Davis stood up, and his presence commanded attention. He was calm but sharp, his mind laser-focused on the task at hand. "Your Honor," Mr. Davis began, "we are here today because my client, Mr. Jake Thompson, was wrongfully convicted. The evidence that was originally presented at trial was not complete. Specifically, crucial surveillance footage that exonerates my client was withheld by the prosecution. This footage clearly shows that Mr. Thompson was nowhere near the scene of the crime at the time it occurred." The room fell silent. Jake could feel the eyes of the courtroom on him, but he tried to block it out. The truth was on their side now. The footage was irrefutable. Mr. Davis continued. "We have submitted the footage to be reviewed by independent experts, and it has been authenticated. We ask that you consider this new evidence and reopen this case." He motioned toward the screen, and the courtroom's attention shifted as a video began to play. The footage was grainy at first, but then it became clear. The timestamp indicated that it was from the night of the crime, Jake's crime, at least according to the prosecution. The footage showed a man entering the building where the crime had taken place, but it was not Jake. It wasn't even close. The man in the footage was of a different build, a different height, and his face was clearly visible. A murmur spread throughout the room as the footage played on. Jake could see Harding's face tighten with frustration. She had been so sure, so confident in her case, and now it was slipping through her fingers. "This footage," Mr. Davis continued, "is the key to my client's innocence. It shows that at the time the crime was committed, Mr. Thompson was not in the vicinity. He was elsewhere, as we have already established with several alibis. The prosecution, however, chose to overlook this crucial detail, and as a result, my client was wrongfully convicted. Jake's breath caught in his throat. For the first time, he could see a crack in the armor of the prosecution. Mrs. Harding was no longer the confident, unyielding prosecutor she had been just a few months ago. Now, she was visibly shaken. Her response was swift, almost desperate. Your Honor, while the defense claims this footage exonerates the defendant, the validity of this footage remains in question. We have not been given adequate time to review it and authenticate its source. This is an attempt to undermine the conviction with a piece of evidence that may not even be admissible. The judge raised a hand, silencing the room. We will take a short recess to allow both sides to review the footage and the corresponding evidence. We will reconvene in 1 hour. Jake sat back down, his mind racing. The courtroom emptied briefly as people filed out to take a break. He could see Sarah and Mr. Davis talking in low voices, probably strategizing their next steps. Harding, however, looked angry, pacing back and forth, whispering urgently to her team. Do you think they're going to try and discredit it? Jake whispered to Sarah, leaning in slightly. Sarah nodded. It's possible. But they'll have a hard time doing that. The footage is legit, and the experts we've brought in have verified it. If they try to claim it's inadmissible, they'll need to prove why. Jake's stomach churned. He wasn't sure how long he could keep up this level of uncertainty. It felt like he was standing on the edge of a cliff, waiting for someone to either push him off or pull him back to safety. The recess was too short to calm his nerves. As the doors to the courtroom opened again, everyone filed back in. The tension was palpable, and Jake could sense that this was the moment of reckoning. The judge called the court to order, his voice steady but serious. After reviewing the footage and the evidence presented, I believe there is sufficient grounds to allow it as part of the trial. However, I will allow the prosecution one final opportunity to contest the validity of the evidence. Mrs. Harding stood up again, her face taut with frustration. Your Honor, we object. We believe the evidence is tainted and inadmissible for reasons we will present shortly. The judge's eyes narrowed. I'll hear your arguments. Proceed. As Harding began her attempt to discredit the evidence, Jake found himself holding his breath. He was so close to the truth. But would they let it stand? Would they see past the lies that had held him captive for so long? The trial was far from over, but Jake's hope surged. It felt like the first glimmer of light after a long, dark night. And in that moment, Jake Thompson knew one thing for sure: he wasn't going to stop fighting until the truth was heard. No matter what it took. The tension in the courtroom could be cut with a knife. Jake's heart hammered in his chest as Mrs. Harding made her case, her voice sharp and filled with a sense of defiance. She was a skilled prosecutor, and the fact that she had to fight tooth and nail to discredit the new footage only fueled her sense of urgency. But Jake could see through her bravado. Deep down, she knew the tide was turning. Your Honor, Mrs. Harding began, while the defense has presented this footage as exonerating evidence, we must question its authenticity. We cannot ignore the possibility that this footage was manipulated, doctored, or selectively edited to create a false narrative. The timestamp could easily have been altered, and the quality of the video is inconsistent with what would be expected from a professional security system. The room fell silent as the judge gave Mrs. Harding his full attention. The weight of the moment was palpable. Jake's eyes flickered toward Mr. Davis, who remained calm and composed. It was clear he had anticipated this line of attack, and Jake had to trust that his lawyer would handle it. Your Honor, if I may, Mr. Davis interjected, his voice steady but firm. The footage we have presented has been verified by independent forensic experts. They have analyzed the file's metadata and the video quality, and have concluded that the timestamp is accurate and that the video has not been altered in any way. We also have the testimony of several witnesses who can confirm that Mr. Thompson was nowhere near the crime scene at the time of the incident. This evidence is irrefutable. Jake could see Mrs. Harding's composure beginning to crack. She had prepared for a lot of things in this trial, but this wasn't one of them. The prosecution's strategy had been based on the idea that Jake was guilty, no matter what. They hadn't expected someone like Mr. Davis to fight back with such a methodical, relentless defense. The judge didn't say anything for a long while, his gaze fixed on the two sides. Finally, he leaned forward, his expression unreadable. "I've heard enough," the judge said. "I will allow the footage to stand as evidence. We will proceed with the trial. Mrs. Harding, you may present your next argument." Jake felt a sense of victory wash over him, but it was tempered with caution. This was just one small battle won in a much larger war. The retrial wasn't over yet, and the road ahead was still uncertain. As the courtroom settled into silence, Mr. Davis exchanged a brief, approving glance with Sarah. Jake, for the first time in a long while, allowed himself a small sigh of relief. The truth was on his side. He could feel it in his bones. The trial continued for several more days, each one a fierce back and forth between the defense and the prosecution. But with the critical new evidence, especially the surveillance footage, on their side, Jake and his team felt more confident. Every witness they called, every argument they made, built a stronger case for Jake's innocence. Sarah worked tirelessly, cross-examining witnesses with surgical precision, dismantling the prosecution's arguments piece by piece. Jake found himself in awe of her skill. She wasn't just a lawyer, she was a force to be reckoned with. Her unwavering belief in his innocence kept him grounded during the darkest moments, and he found himself beginning to trust her in ways he hadn't trusted anyone in a long time. During one of the breaks, Jake had a quiet conversation with her in the hallway outside the courtroom. "I don't know how to thank you," Jake said, his voice soft. "You've done more for me than anyone ever has. I don't know what I would have done without you." Sarah looked at him with a gentle but determined smile. "Jake, you don't need to thank me. You're the one who's been fighting this whole time. All I'm doing is helping you get what you deserve, your freedom. That's all that matters." Her words resonated deeply with him. It wasn't just about proving his innocence anymore. It was about redemption, about finding a way to move forward after everything that had been taken from him. Jake looked down at the floor for a moment, his thoughts swirling. "I don't know if I can ever fully forgive myself for everything that's happened," he said quietly. I wish I could have done things differently. I wish I hadn't let the wrong people into my life. I wish I hadn't trusted the wrong people." Sarah placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch firm yet comforting. "You're human, Jake. We all make mistakes. What matters now is that you're doing everything you can to fix them. You're fighting for the truth. You're fighting for yourself. That's what counts." Jake nodded, the weight of her words sinking in. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he was on the right path. He was fighting for justice, not just for himself, but for the people who had supported him, for the family who had believed in him, and for the friends who had never given up on him. The final moments of the trial were the most nerve-wracking. The defense had made its case, presenting evidence and witnesses that could not be ignored. The prosecution, however, still had one final move to make. Mrs. Harding stood up, her expression cold and calculated. "Your Honor," she began, "while we acknowledge that the defense has presented new evidence, we cannot ignore the fact that Mr. Thompson had the motive, the opportunity, and the means to commit this crime. His previous record, the testimonies of those who knew him, and the circumstances surrounding the crime all point to his guilt. We ask that you consider all of these factors when making your final ruling." Jake's stomach twisted. The fear that had been gnawing at him throughout the trial surged back to the forefront. No matter how strong his case was, no matter how much evidence he had on his side, there was always the possibility that the judge would side with the prosecution. The truth, he knew, wasn't always enough. The judge, however, seemed unmoved by Mrs. Harding's final appeal. He had heard it all before. He had seen how the case had evolved, and he had witnessed firsthand the shift in momentum toward the defense. It was clear that he had made up his mind. "I have considered all the evidence presented in this case," the judge said, his voice steady. "I have reviewed the new footage, the testimonies, and the arguments made by both sides. After careful deliberation, I find that there is sufficient doubt regarding the defendant's guilt. Therefore, I am dismissing all charges against Mr. Jake Thompson." Jake's heart stopped. The words hung in the air for a moment before the gavel slammed down. "Not guilty," the judge declared. A wave of disbelief washed over Jake, followed by an overwhelming sense of relief. It was as if a weight he had been carrying for years had suddenly been lifted from his shoulders. He wasn't guilty. He was free. The courtroom erupted into murmurs, and Mr. Davis gave him a quick, triumphant smile. Sarah, her eyes shining with pride, gave him a nod of encouragement. Jake stood there, stunned, still trying to process the words that had just changed his life forever. As Jake walked out of the courtroom, the door swinging behind him, he stepped into the sunlight, his first taste of freedom in so long. The world outside felt different, as though it had opened up for the first time. And though there was still much left to face, much left to rebuild, Jake Thompson knew one thing for certain: he was free. The truth had won. And that was only the beginning. The days following the trial felt like a surreal blur to Jake. After the verdict, life outside the courthouse seemed to stretch endlessly before him. The world that had once been filled with the harsh confines of a prison cell, the dread of wrongful conviction, and the weight of a shattered future now felt like an open landscape, waiting for him to take the first step into it. As Jake left the courthouse that day, his mind was still reeling, but a deep sense of peace began to settle over him. He was free. Truly free. The air outside was crisp, the sky a clear blue, a stark contrast to the gray, oppressive clouds that had loomed over his life for so long. People on the streets didn't recognize him, and in that anonymity, Jake found a strange kind of solace. For a moment, he could simply blend in, not just as a victim of circumstance, but as a person, Jake Thompson, no longer the defendant, the wrongly accused, or the prisoner. Just Jake. He didn't know where to go, but he didn't have to decide that immediately. For the first time in a long while, Jake had the luxury of time. Sarah walked beside him, her strides matching his as they made their way toward the parking lot. She had been with him every step of the way during the trial, her dedication unshaken. And now that it was all over, the weight of everything that had transpired in the last few months seemed to begin to hit him. "You all right?" Sarah asked, her voice soft yet filled with concern. Jake turned to her, offering a shaky smile. "Yeah. Just, trying to wrap my head around everything." She nodded knowingly. "I can't even imagine how overwhelming this must be. You've been through so much, and now, you're free. It's a lot to process, but take your time. There's no rush." Jake stopped walking for a moment, the reality of it all hitting him harder than before. He had been so focused on the fight for his freedom that he hadn't stopped to think about what would happen after. What did freedom look like for him now? What would his life be like without the shadow of a wrongful conviction hanging over him? "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice heavy with gratitude. "I don't know if I can ever repay you for everything you've done." Sarah smiled, but it was a soft, almost melancholic smile. "You don't have to repay me, Jake. The only thing you need to do now is live your life. That's all." The simplicity of her words made something tighten in Jake's chest. He had spent so long fighting for his freedom, focusing solely on survival, that he hadn't thought about what he wanted out of life now that he had it. Jake didn't have all the answers, and he wasn't sure how to move forward, but he did know one thing for certain: he wasn't alone. Not anymore. Not with Sarah by his side. A few days later, Jake sat at a small cafe, sipping coffee and staring at the city streets. It was a Wednesday afternoon, and the cafe was quiet, save for the occasional clink of a coffee cup or the hum of the espresso machine. He'd taken the time to call his family after the trial, and their reactions had been a mix of joy, disbelief, and relief. His mother, especially, had been crying when she heard the news, overwhelmed with emotion after everything she had gone through during his conviction. Jake hadn't even realized how much his family had suffered with him, how much they had carried that burden. His father had been more reserved, but Jake could hear the pride in his voice. They didn't say it, but he could feel it, the pride that he had fought back, that he hadn't given up, that he had stood tall through all of it. But as he sat at the cafe, he realized that there was still so much to rebuild. So many relationships needed mending, so many parts of his life had been left behind in the chaos of the trial. Jake wasn't sure where to start. What did he do now? Sarah had suggested he take things one day at a time. And that was what he was trying to do. Jake. The voice was familiar, and when Jake looked up, he saw his childhood friend, Brian, standing in front of him. Brian was tall, his features sharp but warm, and his smile was wide. Jake hadn't seen him in years, since before the arrest, before everything had spiraled out of control. "Brian?" Jake said, his voice uncertain at first. "What are you doing here?" Brian pulled out a chair and sat down across from Jake, his expression kind. "I heard the news, man. I couldn't believe it. I'm so glad you're out. I've been thinking about you a lot lately." Jake's chest tightened, but he tried to smile. "Thanks. It's been a crazy few months." "Crazy doesn't even begin to cover it," Brian said, shaking his head. "I remember when everything went down. I tried to reach out, but you were so caught up in the fight that I didn't want to push. But I'm glad to see you're still standing." Jake felt the weight of Brian's words. He had been so consumed with proving his innocence that he had pushed away everyone around him, including the people who had cared about him the most. The trial had become his entire world, and in the process, he had lost sight of the life and the people waiting for him outside of that courtroom. "I should have reached out," Jake admitted, looking down at his coffee. "I guess I didn't want anyone to see me like that. I didn't want to drag anyone into it." Brian shook his head. "You don't have to explain yourself, man. We all knew you weren't guilty. It's hard to watch someone you care about go through something like that. But now that you're out, I'm just glad to see you here, trying to figure things out." The sincerity in Brian's voice hit Jake like a wave, and he felt a surge of emotion he hadn't expected. He had lost so much, but in this moment, he realized how much he still had, how much had been waiting for him, patiently, on the other side. "I don't even know where to start," Jake admitted. "Everything feels so different. Like I'm a stranger in my own life." Brian smiled, his tone light-hearted. "You don't have to have it all figured out, Jake. Just take it one step at a time. You've got time now. And you've got people who care about you. That's all that matters." Jake nodded, his heart lifting just a little. For the first time in a long time, he felt like there was hope, like he could rebuild. He didn't have all the answers yet, but for the first time since the trial began, he felt like maybe, just maybe, he could find his way back. As Brian and Jake talked, it became clear to Jake that the road ahead wasn't going to be easy. But it was his to walk. And now, for the first time, he was ready to take that first step. He had been through hell, and yet, he had survived. It was time for him to live again. Later that evening, Jake sat alone in his small apartment, the silence of the space somehow comforting. He had a lot to think about, but there was one thing that stood out above all else: he was free. The past was behind him, and the future, though uncertain, was his to shape. As he gazed out the window, Jake couldn't help but smile. Life was full of second chances, and he had just been given his. It was time to make the most of it. The rest of his story was yet to be written. And for the first time in a long time, he was ready to write it. Jake woke up the next morning to the sound of birds chirping outside his window. The sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting long, golden beams across the room. He sat up slowly, his gaze fixed on the ceiling, as though trying to absorb the reality of his freedom. It felt surreal. He had spent so long in the confines of that courtroom, fighting to prove his innocence, that waking up without the weight of a wrongful conviction looming over him felt almost too good to be true. For years, his life had been defined by the false accusations, the trial, the uncertainty, and the fear. Now, he had his life back, at least, in theory. But the question still lingered in his mind: what now? What did he do with this newfound freedom? He stretched, wincing slightly as his muscles adjusted to the movements. The toll of the past few months, the strain of the trial, was still fresh. But his body felt lighter, his heart a little less burdened. Jake stood up and walked toward the kitchen, his mind running a mile a minute. He could still hear Sarah's voice in his head from yesterday, telling him to take things one step at a time. He knew that was good advice, but it was hard to know where to start. He poured himself a cup of coffee, the rich aroma filling the room, and sat down at the small kitchen table. The space was modest, but it felt like home. It felt like the beginning of something new. He could hear the sounds of the city outside, people going about their daily routines, cars passing by, the distant hum of life continuing on as usual. And for the first time in ages, Jake wasn't caught in the undertow of his past. He was part of that rhythm again, free to choose his path. The first phone call he made that morning was to his mom. The sound of her voice brought him comfort, as always. She had been his rock throughout the trial, never doubting his innocence, always believing in him, even when the world around them had turned its back. "Jake, sweetheart, how are you feeling today?" His mom's voice was soft but full of warmth. "I'm okay, Mom," Jake replied, a lump forming in his throat. Still trying to process everything, you know." "I understand," she said, a sigh of relief in her voice. "I can't believe this day is finally here. I always knew you were innocent. You've been through so much, and now it's over. You're free." Jake sat in silence for a moment, the weight of her words sinking in. He hadn't realized just how much the burden of her worry had been weighing on him too. His mom had been through so much because of him, because of the charges, the trial, the never-ending uncertainty about his fate. "Yeah, it's over," Jake said, the words almost foreign on his lips. I don't know where to go from here." His mom paused, then spoke gently. "Take your time, sweetheart. You don't have to have all the answers right now. Just take it day by day. You've got so much to look forward to. You've got your whole life ahead of you." Jake smiled, his heart swelling at the sound of her encouragement. His mom was right, he didn't have to figure everything out in one go. He had time. And for once, that time didn't feel like a countdown to something bad. It felt like a chance to build something new. Later that day, Jake met up with Brian again. They hadn't spent much time together during the trial, but Brian had been there for him in other ways, sending letters, leaving messages, offering support. Now that the trial was over, they could finally pick up where they left off. Jake was still trying to wrap his mind around what had happened, but Brian's presence helped ground him. Brian was one of the few people who had truly believed in his innocence from the start. And as they sat in the same cafe from the other day, catching up on old times, Jake realized just how much he had missed having real, untainted friendships. "So, what now?" Brian asked, leaning back in his chair, his tone casual but with a sense of curiosity. "I mean, the whole world is open to you, man. What do you want to do?" Jake thought about it for a long moment, the question pressing down on him. He had never truly considered what he wanted beyond proving his innocence. The goal had been so singular, to get out of that nightmare. But now that he was out, there was no easy answer. "I don't really know yet," Jake admitted, his hands resting on the table. "I just want to find my place again. I want to rebuild, you know. I lost so much during this whole thing, relationships, opportunities, time. I need to figure out who I am without all the baggage. Brian nodded, understanding. It's gonna take time. But you'll get there. You're not the same person you were when all this started. You've been through something most people will never experience. But that's not who you are now. Who you are now is someone who's been through hell and came out the other side stronger. Jake's lips curled into a small smile. I hope so. The days that followed were a whirlwind of emotions. Jake spent time reconnecting with family and friends, slowly rebuilding the relationships that had been strained or broken during his time in the legal system. There were moments of joy, as he found his footing again. And there were moments of pain, as he came face to face with the damage the trial had caused, not just to him but to the people around him. But through it all, Jake clung to the idea of moving forward. He knew that his past would always be a part of him. It was impossible to erase the scars, the memories, and the pain. But he also knew that his future was still in his hands, and that was the part that mattered now. The following weekend, Sarah invited him to a small gathering with a few of her friends, people who had supported her during the trial. It was a simple evening, filled with laughter, good food, and a sense of normalcy that felt like a breath of fresh air. Jake found himself slowly easing into the conversation, laughing along with the others, and feeling, for the first time in years, like he was part of something good. It was easy to forget the heavy past when surrounded by people who saw him for who he truly was, not the man who had been wrongfully accused. And in that moment, Jake realized something important. He had a future that wasn't defined by his mistakes or the mistakes of others. As the evening wound down, Jake found himself standing on the balcony, looking out over the city. The lights twinkled below, and for the first time, he felt at peace. The weight of the past no longer held him down, and he wasn't defined by the events that had transpired. He was Jake Thompson. A man with a future. A future that was his to create. Jake's journey wasn't over, not by a long shot. There were still challenges ahead, obstacles he would have to overcome, and the scars of the past that would continue to shape him. But for the first time in a long time, he had hope. Hope for a new beginning, hope for redemption, and hope for a life filled with the things that truly mattered, love, friendship, and the freedom to choose his own path. And as he stood on that balcony, the city stretching out before him, Jake knew that the best was yet to come. The journey had just begun. It had been a week since the gathering with Sarah's friends, and the quiet sense of normalcy that Jake had started to find in his life was beginning to settle in. But just as he felt like he was starting to regain some sense of balance, another wave of uncertainty hit him. While the courtroom drama had ended, the emotional turmoil of everything that had happened was far from over. There were still countless questions, both internal and external, that Jake had yet to face. One of those questions had to do with his future. With his record cleared, Jake had the chance to rebuild his life, but what did that mean? What did a man whose life had been stolen away by wrongful conviction even want now? Jake spent the next few days doing something he hadn't done in a long time, reflecting. He walked around the city, took in the sights, and let his mind wander. The people who had once been a distant blur in his life, strangers on the street, now felt like part of his reality again. He felt small in the vastness of the world, but not in a way that was overwhelming. It felt freeing, like he was allowed to exist again without the oppressive weight of being a suspect or a defendant. But what did this freedom mean for him? That evening, as he sat at the small coffee shop where he had met Brian a few days ago, Jake realized that the question wasn't about what he should do, it was about who he wanted to be. The trial had defined his life for so long, it was as if he had no identity outside of the courtroom. And now that the trial was over, he found himself confronted with the blank canvas of his life. The questions that came with it were daunting. "Hey, Jake." Jake turned to see Sarah standing at the entrance of the cafe, a warm smile on her face. It was a comfort to see her. She had been an anchor for him through all of this, and her presence in his life made him feel like he wasn't entirely lost. "Hey, Sarah." Jake motioned to the empty chair across from him. "How's it going?" "Good. You seem—" "I don't know," pensive, Sarah said, sliding into the chair. Jake exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Yeah, just thinking. A lot of things going through my mind. I'm trying to figure out who I am now." Sarah studied him for a moment, her expression softening. "That's understandable. You've been through so much. It's normal to feel a little lost after everything that happened. But, Jake, you're not alone in this." Jake gave a small, rueful smile. "Yeah, I know. It's just weird. For the longest time, I only knew myself as a defendant, someone who was wronged. But now I have a chance to be something else. And I don't know what that looks like." Sarah's eyes softened, her voice gentle. "I think that's okay. You don't need to know right away. It's okay to take your time. This is your chance to explore who you are, what you want. You don't have to rush into anything." Jake sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's just hard. I feel like I've wasted so much time. So many years just taken from me." Sarah reached across the table and placed a reassuring hand on his. "Jake, those years weren't wasted. You fought for your life. You fought for your freedom. That's not something anyone can take away from you. And now you have the freedom to do whatever you want with the rest of your life." For a moment, Jake allowed her words to sink in. Freedom. He had fought for it. And now he had it. It wasn't just about being free from prison or a courtroom. It was about being free to choose. "Maybe you're right," he said, his voice low but thoughtful. "I guess it's just going to take some time to adjust to all this. But I want to try." Sarah smiled, and for the first time in a long while, Jake felt a spark of hope, real hope. Not just for his future, but for the possibility of becoming something greater than what he had been before. The following week was a blur of meetings, phone calls, and quiet reflection. Jake had begun looking into different job opportunities, trying to get a sense of what he might want to do with his life. He had always been interested in technology. Before the arrest, he had dreamed of becoming a software developer. But his years in prison had left him disconnected from the field, and he wasn't sure how to re-enter the workforce. Still, Sarah encouraged him to explore what excited him, no matter how big or small. He wasn't sure if he could immediately dive into the tech world again, but he did know that he wanted to do something meaningful. Something that would allow him to rebuild and make a difference. And then, one afternoon, while scrolling through job listings online, Jake saw an ad for a program designed to help people who had been wrongfully convicted reintegrate into society. The job was for a support coordinator, someone who would help guide people who had experienced the criminal justice system navigate the challenges of rebuilding their lives. The idea immediately resonated with him. He applied. It was 2 weeks later when he received the call. He'd been selected for an interview. Jake walked into the office feeling nervous but hopeful. As he sat down in the small, modest conference room, he found himself staring at the neatly arranged documents in front of him, feeling a strange combination of excitement and fear. This job, this opportunity, it felt like the first real step toward reclaiming his life. The interview went smoothly, with Jake discussing his personal experiences and the challenges of being wrongfully convicted. He spoke openly about his desire to help others who had been through similar experiences. The interviewers listened intently, and Jake found himself being drawn into the conversation more than he had expected. When the interview ended, they thanked him for his time and told him they would be in touch soon. Jake didn't have to wait long. A few days later, the call came. He had been offered the position. The news was surreal. It felt like he was being given a chance to make something positive out of his past, to turn his painful experience into a source of strength for others. It wasn't a full return to the career he had once dreamed of, but it felt like the beginning of something meaningful, something real. And that was enough for now. In the weeks that followed, Jake threw himself into his new job. The work wasn't easy. Helping people who had been wrongfully convicted navigate the complexities of rebuilding their lives required patience, empathy, and an understanding of the emotional weight they carried. But Jake felt a deep sense of purpose in what he was doing. For the first time since his release, he felt like he was part of something bigger than himself, a movement toward justice and healing for those who had been wronged, just as he had been. As Jake worked with people who had experienced similar pain and injustice, he realized something important. His path forward wasn't about erasing his past, it was about using it to create change. He wasn't defined by the wrongful conviction. He wasn't defined by the pain or the loss. He was defined by how he chose to move forward. And moving forward, Jake was ready to do whatever it took to make a difference. That evening, after a long day at the office, Jake sat down on his apartment balcony, looking out over the city. The cool breeze washed over him, and for the first time in a long time, Jake felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. His journey wasn't over. There would be more challenges ahead. But now, more than ever, he knew he had the strength to face them. He had freedom. He had purpose. And with that, Jake felt ready to take on whatever came next. The road to redemption was long, but Jake was finally walking it. The days seemed to pass in a blur as Jake settled into his new role at the reintegration program. While he was proud of the work he was doing, something deep inside him gnawed at his peace. It wasn't that he didn't enjoy helping others. In fact, it was the most fulfilling thing he had ever done. But the weight of his past still lingered in subtle ways, doubts, regrets, and fears that his work wouldn't be enough. It was as though the past hadn't fully let go of him, even though he had let go of it to the best of his ability. That night, as Jake sat on his couch, his phone buzzed. It was a text message from Sarah. "Sarah, hey, can we talk? I've been thinking about you a lot lately." Jake frowned. He hadn't spoken to Sarah much outside of work lately. Their friendship had always been a constant, but now it felt as though they were both adjusting to their new realities. He quickly replied, "Sure, what's up?" A few minutes later, the phone rang. He recognized the number, it was Sarah. "Hey," he answered, his voice steady but laced with a trace of curiosity. "Hey, Jake," Sarah's voice was soft, but Jake could hear the hesitation. "I wanted to check in with you. You've been doing so much for other people, helping them rebuild their lives, but I've noticed that you haven't really given yourself the same chance." Jake sighed and rubbed his temples. "It's not that I don't care about myself. I'm just focused on the work. It feels good to help people, Sarah. I've seen what happens to people who get out after being wrongfully convicted. Some never recover. They never find their footing again. So, helping them, it feels like I'm doing something important." There was a pause on the other end of the line before Sarah spoke again. "Jake, I get it. But what about you? You've been through so much. You haven't had the time to really heal. I've seen you put all your energy into the program, but you never talk about how you're feeling, or what you need. How are you really doing?" Jake bit his lip, a wave of frustration rising inside him. He didn't want to admit it, but Sarah was right. There had been moments where the emotional toll had overwhelmed him, but he had been too focused on the work, too afraid that if he stopped to look inward, the weight of everything would crush him. "I'm fine," he said, though his voice didn't sound convincing. "I'm just busy." "Jake," Sarah's voice softened even more, her concern palpable. "You're allowed to take a break. You're allowed to care about yourself too. You're not a machine. If you don't address your own needs, you'll burn out." The truth of her words hit Jake harder than he expected. He had been running from his emotions, his pain, and his uncertainty by diving headfirst into the work. But it was catching up to him now, and he couldn't ignore it any longer. "You're right," Jake finally admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what to do with everything inside of me. The guilt. The fear. The anger, sometimes it feels like it's all still there, just under the surface. And I don't know how to deal with it. Sarah's voice was steady, full of empathy. You don't have to have all the answers right now. But you do have to take care of yourself. I know you're helping people, but don't forget that you matter too. You've been through a lot, and it's okay to feel like you need time to heal. Jake took a deep breath. I've been running for so long, I didn't even realize how much I've been avoiding the pain. I thought if I kept going, I'd somehow outrun it, but it's still here, isn't it? It's not about outrunning it, Jake, Sarah said gently. It's about acknowledging it, feeling it, and then letting it go when you're ready. You don't have to do it alone. Jake sat in silence for a few moments, the weight of Sarah's words settling on him. He knew she was right. He had been so focused on proving himself, on doing something to make up for all the time he had lost, that he had neglected to deal with the emotional cost of everything that had happened. I guess I don't really know how to start, Jake said, the vulnerability in his voice more pronounced now. That's okay, Sarah reassured him. It's a process. Just take it one step at a time. But promise me you'll let yourself feel what you need to feel, and take the time to heal, too. Jake nodded slowly. I promise. The next day, Jake made an appointment with a therapist. It wasn't easy. He had spent so long pushing away his emotions that the idea of confronting them felt like stepping into uncharted territory. But as he sat in the waiting room of the small office, he felt a strange mixture of nervousness and relief. He was taking the first step in confronting the pain he had buried for so long. Dr. Lopez, the therapist, greeted him warmly and led him into a cozy office. The room was filled with soft lighting and calming colors, a stark contrast to the harsh fluorescent lights he had grown accustomed to during his time in courtrooms and prisons. It felt safe. So, Jake, Dr. Lopez began after a few moments of settling in, I'm glad you're here. This is a space where you can talk about whatever you feel comfortable sharing. Jake took a deep breath. He didn't know where to start. But as the words came, they tumbled out faster than he expected. He found himself talking about the trial, the hopelessness, the fear, and the shame that had followed him for so long. And then, deeper still, the anger that had smoldered inside of him, anger at the system, at the people who had wronged him, at himself for not being able to fix things faster. Dr. Lopez listened intently, nodding at appropriate moments, but Jake barely noticed. The more he spoke, the lighter he felt. It was as if each word released a small piece of the weight he had been carrying. The emotions that had once been so overwhelming were now something he could start to make sense of. By the time the session ended, Jake felt both exhausted and strangely liberated. He realized that he had never given himself permission to feel all these things. For so long, he had been in survival mode, fighting to prove his innocence, fighting to regain his freedom. But now, for the first time, he was finally allowing himself to be vulnerable. As he walked out of the office, the weight in his chest felt just a little bit lighter. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy. He had a long way to go in terms of healing, both emotionally and mentally. But he knew one thing for certain, he was no longer running from his pain. Jake had taken the first step toward redemption, not just for the world around him, but for himself. It wasn't long after that Jake began to see real progress. His work at the reintegration program flourished as he became more present, more attuned to the needs of those he was helping. But more importantly, he started making space for himself, space to grieve, to heal, and to build the life he had always deserved. His relationship with Sarah deepened as well, not just as friends, but as two people who had walked through darkness and were now learning how to live in the light again. They spent more time together, talking about everything and nothing, and in those small moments, Jake began to rediscover joy. He hadn't felt joy in so long. The journey wasn't over. But Jake was beginning to understand that healing wasn't a destination. It was a process. And as long as he continued to walk forward, he knew he'd find his way. The cost of redemption was steep, but the reward was beginning to show itself. And Jake was ready for whatever came next. Jake's life, once filled with chaos and uncertainty, had found a rhythm. The work at the reintegration program was rewarding, and he was starting to feel like he was making a real difference. His days were filled with counseling sessions, helping people who had been through the same nightmare he once did. He had found purpose. And yet, despite all the positive steps he had made, the journey ahead was not without its challenges. It was late one afternoon when Jake received a call that would shake his world once again. He had just wrapped up a session with a former inmate who had spent almost a decade behind bars for a crime he didn't commit. The man, named Marcus, had been struggling to adjust to life outside of prison. His story resonated deeply with Jake, and he couldn't help but see the parallels in their lives. As Jake sat at his desk, still reflecting on the session, his phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but the area code was local, so he answered. "Hello?" Jake said, unsure of what to expect. "Mr. Evans," a woman's voice came through the line. "This is Detective Laura Williams from the local police department. We need to talk." Jake felt a chill run through him. The voice on the other end was calm, but there was something unsettling about it. He leaned forward in his chair. "About what?" he asked, his heart racing. "There's been a development in the case that cleared your name," Detective Williams replied. "We need you to come in." Jake felt the blood drain from his face. He had thought his past was behind him. He had worked so hard to move forward, to build something new. But now it seemed the past wasn't done with him. "I'm at work right now," Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Can I come in tomorrow?" "That won't be necessary," Detective Williams responded, her tone flat. "We need you here as soon as possible." Jake knew he had no choice but to comply. He told his supervisor he had to leave for an emergency and drove to the police station, his mind swirling with dread and confusion. As he walked through the familiar entrance of the precinct, memories of his past flashed before him, his time in the holding cell, the cold, sterile walls of the interrogation rooms. It felt like he was being pulled back into a nightmare he thought he had escaped. Detective Williams was waiting for him in a small, dimly lit room. She motioned for Jake to sit down. As he did, she placed a folder on the table between them, the sound of paper shuffling in the silence making the moment feel even heavier. "We found something," she said, sliding the folder toward him. Jake's hand trembled as he reached for it. He opened the folder, scanning the pages inside. His stomach twisted into knots as he saw the word "evidence" on the first page. The photos that followed were haunting, grainy images from a new investigation into the case that had sent him to prison. He could hardly process what he was seeing, but the weight of it was clear: the past was not done with him yet. "This was taken from a new lead in the investigation," Detective Williams continued. "We've come across new evidence that suggests your conviction may not have been as clear-cut as we originally thought." Jake's mind raced. His heart pounded in his chest. It was as if the world had been ripped from beneath him. Everything he had worked for, his job, his sense of normalcy, his relationships, suddenly felt like they were on the brink of unraveling. "What does this mean?" Jake asked, his voice hoarse. "I can't say much right now," she replied. "But we need to re-examine the evidence. We need you to cooperate with us." Jake stared at her, feeling the weight of the words sinking in. Could it be possible? After all these years? After everything he had been through, was there still a chance that his conviction had been justified? He had always been sure of his innocence, but now, in the face of new evidence, he was unsure of anything. "I don't understand," Jake said, his voice trembling. "You cleared me. You said I was innocent." "We did," Detective Williams said. "But there are things we didn't see at the time. Things we missed. We need to investigate this further. It might just be a misunderstanding, but we can't ignore it." Jake felt like the ground was slipping away from beneath him. For a moment, he couldn't breathe. He had already fought so hard to clear his name. To be free. And now, everything was in question once again. He had thought he was finished with this part of his life. But now it seemed the past was coming back to haunt him, stronger than ever. Jake spent the rest of the evening at home, unable to focus on anything other than the conversation he had just had with Detective Williams. It felt like he was trapped in a nightmare, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't escape it. Sarah called later that night, sensing his distress. "Jake? What's going on?" she asked, her voice full of concern. Jake struggled to find the words. They want to reopen the case. They found new evidence." Sarah was silent for a moment. "What does that mean?" It means everything we thought was over might not be. They said there's a chance my conviction wasn't as clear as they thought. That maybe I wasn't innocent after all," Jake said, the weight of the words crashing down on him. "Oh, Jake," Sarah's voice softened. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Jake replied, his voice thick with emotion. I don't know what to do anymore. I thought I had this figured out. I thought I was free." "I know," Sarah said, her voice full of empathy. "But you fought so hard for this freedom. And you're not going to stop fighting now. You didn't do anything wrong, Jake. You know that. This new evidence, it doesn't change the fact that you're innocent." Jake closed his eyes, feeling a sense of relief wash over him at her words. He had to believe that. He had to hold on to that truth, no matter what this new development meant. He wasn't going to let his past define him. Not now. Not ever again. "I'll help you through this," Sarah continued. "We'll figure this out together." And in that moment, Jake knew he wasn't alone. He had fought for his freedom before. And he would fight again, because his future, his redemption, was worth it. No matter what the past held, he would stand tall and face it head-on. The road ahead was unclear, but Jake was ready for the challenge. He had faced the darkness before. And he would do it again. The next few weeks were filled with sleepless nights and anxious days. Jake had thrown himself into the case, reviewing every piece of evidence, every detail that might have been overlooked the first time. The new lead, while unsettling, had also reignited a fire in him, one that he thought had burned out a long time ago. The feeling of uncertainty was still there, but so was the fierce determination to prove that he had been right all along. He couldn't let the truth slip through his fingers now, not after everything he had sacrificed to rebuild his life. The pain of his wrongful conviction was still raw, but now it served as a fuel to power his resolve. He was not going to let anyone take his freedom away again. The weight of the new evidence pressed heavily on his shoulders, though. The photos and reports Detective Williams had shown him were enough to suggest that his original conviction might have been flawed. But the more Jake read through the case files, the more he realized that the truth wasn't as clear-cut as he had hoped. There were gaps in the investigation, inconsistencies in witness testimonies, and evidence that had never been fully examined. Detective Williams kept in touch with him, guiding him through the process. She was committed to finding the truth, but Jake knew this wasn't just about the case anymore, it was about proving to the world, and to himself, that he deserved the life he had fought so hard to build. One evening, as Jake sat in his apartment, sorting through the files, Sarah called him again. It had become a routine, one he was grateful for. She'd been his rock, the one person who had been there for him when everything felt like it was slipping away. "Jake?" Sarah's voice came through the phone, light but concerned. "How are you holding up?" Jake leaned back in his chair, rubbing his eyes. "I don't know anymore, Sarah. The more I look at this, the less sure I am of anything. It's like the whole thing is a puzzle with pieces that don't fit together, and I'm just trying to make it work." "Jake, you've come so far already," she said, her voice firm with conviction. "You've been through hell and back, and no matter what happens, you've already proven your worth. The past doesn't define you. It doesn't. Jake took a deep breath. Sarah's words were a reminder of what mattered most. He had spent so long worrying about the past, about things he couldn't change, but now, he had to focus on what was in front of him. He had to trust the people who believed in him. "Thanks, Sarah," Jake replied, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "You're right. I can't keep letting this control me. It's not who I am anymore." "Exactly," Sarah said. "And whatever happens, I'll be here, okay?" Jake felt a wave of gratitude wash over him. "I know. And I appreciate it more than you know." The day of the court hearing finally arrived, the moment of truth. Jake stood outside the courthouse, his heart pounding in his chest. The air was crisp, and the morning sun was just starting to peek through the clouds. He was nervous, no, terrified, but he was also resolute. This was it. The last step in the long road to reclaiming his life. Sarah stood by his side as they made their way into the building. She reached out and squeezed his hand, offering him a comforting smile. Jake returned it, though the nerves were still there, threatening to crack his calm exterior. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense. The judge, a stern woman in her early 50s, sat at the front, her gavel resting on the desk. On the other side of the room, the prosecution was already in position. They had a new attorney handling the case, one who was well known for her aggressive tactics. Jake knew this wasn't going to be easy. But he was ready. Detective Williams was there too, sitting beside Jake's attorney, a man named Ethan Daniels, who had been working tirelessly to help Jake navigate the complex legal landscape of his case. Ethan had become more than just a lawyer to Jake, he had become a mentor, someone who truly believed in his innocence. The hearing began with the prosecution presenting their argument, focusing on the new evidence that had been brought to light. They painted a picture of doubt, suggesting that there were holes in the original investigation, but they weren't entirely dismissing Jake's innocence, yet. Then it was Jake's turn. His heart thudded in his chest as Ethan rose to speak. "Your Honor," Ethan began, his voice steady, "we are here today to seek justice, not just for my client, but for the truth. The new evidence that has come to light is important, yes. But it does not change the fact that Jake Evans was wrongfully convicted. The evidence in his original trial was mishandled, misinterpreted, and in some cases, flat out ignored. The only thing that's been consistent is Jake's innocence." The prosecutor sneered. "Your Honor, with all due respect, the evidence we're presenting today suggests that we cannot be sure of Mr. Evans' innocence. There are simply too many unanswered questions." Ethan stood firm. "We understand that the past cannot be erased, but we also cannot ignore the present. My client has paid a steep price for a crime he did not commit. His freedom has been stolen from him for years, and it's time to make things right." The judge listened intently, her gaze sharp as she weighed both sides of the argument. The room fell silent as she leaned forward, her eyes narrowing in concentration. Then, with a slow motion, she spoke, her voice clear and deliberate. "After careful consideration, I have made my decision. The new evidence presented today will be investigated further, but the charges against Jake Evans will be formally dismissed." Jake's breath caught in his chest. His mind couldn't fully process what had just been said. He had won. He was free. The weight that had held him down for so many years finally began to lift, piece by piece. He looked over at Sarah, whose eyes were filled with tears of joy. She hugged him tightly, her arms wrapping around him as if she never wanted to let go. "You did it, Jake. You're free." Tears stung Jake's eyes as he held her back. "We did it," he corrected softly. "I couldn't have done it without you." The courtroom buzzed with quiet excitement, but for Jake, the world had stopped. He was no longer defined by his past. No longer shackled by the mistakes and injustices of others. He had been given a second chance, something he had once thought was impossible. Later that evening, as Jake sat with Sarah at his favorite diner, he reflected on the journey he had been on. The twists, the turns, the pain, and the triumphs. Everything had led him to this moment. "I never thought I'd be here," Jake said, stirring his coffee absent-mindedly. "I've been fighting for so long, and now, it's over." Sarah smiled, her eyes full of warmth. "No, Jake. It's just the beginning." Jake nodded, his heart swelling with a mixture of relief and hope. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure: he was ready to face it. He had fought for his freedom, for his future, and now, it was his to claim. And for the first time in years, Jake felt the weight of the past truly lift. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?